Hey there, history buffs. Tonight we are pulling apart the story of a man who might just be the most contradictory figure of the 20th century. A decorated war hero turned art thief, a morphine addict in a custom-made martial uniform, a guy who literally built himself a palace while his country was falling to pieces. Hermann Göring, the number 2 of the Third Reich, who somehow managed to be both terrifyingly powerful and almost cartoonishly ridiculous at the same time. And honestly, his story is wilder than anything a screenwriter could dream up. Now before we get into it, do me a quick favour, smash that like button if you're into these kinds of deep dives, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. Middle of the night, lunch break, stuck on a bus. I genuinely want to know. Also subscribe if you have not already, because this one is going to be a ride. Alright, settle in, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights a little. Because tonight we are not just telling a biography, we are dissecting how a kid from a fading noble family, a boy who grew up in someone else's castle, eventually became one of the architects behind the darkest chapter in human history. Ready? Let us get into it. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on January 12, 1893, in the Bavarian town of Rosenheim. His father, Heinrich Ernst Göring, was a man who had once been somebody. A former cavalry officer in the Prussian military, Heinrich had served as a colonial administrator in German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, where he governed with the rigid self-importance of a man who believed that a title and a uniform were proof of moral superiority. By the time little Hermann arrived, however, that career was firmly in the past tense. Heinrich was aging, unwell, and most critically broke. The Göring family had status, a respectable surname, connections to the minor Prussian gentry, and absolutely no money to sustain any of it. Think of it as having a VIP pass to a party where you cannot afford a single drink at the bar. This is where the story gets uncomfortable, and also where it gets interesting. Because the Görings did not simply fade into genteel poverty, the way so many minor noble families across Europe did at the turn of the century. Instead, they found a patron. His name was Hermann von Eppenstein. Yes, the boy was literally named after this man. And he was a wealthy physician and businessman of Jewish heritage who had converted to Christianity and been ennobled, purchasing the kind of aristocratic credentials that families like the Görings had inherited, but could no longer afford to maintain. Eppenstein owned not one but 2 castles in Bavaria, and he offered the Göring family the use of one of them, Burg Feldenstein, a medieval fortress perched on a rocky hilltop near Nuremberg, rent-free. No strings attached, supposedly, except there were very obviously strings attached, and everyone in the household knew exactly what they were. Franziska Göring, Hermann's mother, became Eppenstein's mistress. This was not some whispered rumour that historians pieced together decades later from ambiguous diary entries. It was the open, barely concealed reality of daily life in that castle. Heinrich Göring, the proud former colonial governor, the man who had once commanded troops in Africa, was now living under the roof of his wife's lover, dependent on that man's generosity for the food on his table and the walls around his family. If there is a more efficient recipe for breeding resentment in a household, psychology has not yet discovered it. Now imagine being a child in that environment. Young Hermann grew up surrounded by luxury that was not his, in rooms filled with expensive furniture he could not claim, playing in gardens maintained by someone else's money, watching his father, the man who was supposed to be the authority figure, the provider, the head of the family, reduced to a kind of permanent houseguest in his own home. The power dynamics were visible to anyone with eyes, and children, as we know, have very sharp eyes for exactly this kind of adult hypocrisy. Hermann understood, probably before he could fully articulate it, that his family-ass comfort was a gift that could be withdrawn at any moment, and that the person giving that gift had taken something from his father that could never be given back. This arrangement shaped Göring in ways that would echo through the rest of his life, and honestly, a therapist could probably write an entire textbook based on the results. 2 psychological drives emerged from this childhood that would define almost everything he did for the next 5 decades. The first was an almost pathological hunger for status. Not just wealth, but visible, undeniable, look-at-me-now status. The kind of status that nobody could take away or hold over his head. The second was a deep, simmering contempt for people who had money without what he considered proper breeding. In Göring's developing worldview, Eppenstein represented something intolerable, a man who had bought his way into a class he did not truly belong to, and who used that purchased position to humiliate those who did belong but could not pay the membership fees. The irony, of course, is that Göring himself would spend his adult life doing exactly what he despised in Eppenstein, accumulating wealth and status through connections, manipulation, and eventually outright theft. But self-awareness was never going to be his strongest quality. Berg-Weldenstein itself deserves a moment of attention, because the setting of Göring's childhood was not incidental to his character. It was practically a training ground for the man he would become. This was a genuine medieval castle, complete with towers, battlements, and the kind of heavy stone architecture that practically demanded you pretend to be a knight. Young Hermann threw himself into exactly this fantasy, with an intensity that went well beyond normal childhood imagination. He organised the local children into mock military formations, staged elaborate war games across the castle grounds, and appointed himself commander of every expedition. When other boys resisted his authority, because some children have the audacity to not want to be ordered around, he reportedly responded with fury. He was not playing at war, he was rehearsing for it. His schooling did little to sand down these edges. In fact, his formal education was a parade of conflicts, expulsions, and what modern educators would diplomatically call behavioural challenges. At a boarding school in Ansbach, the young Göring clashed so violently with teachers and fellow students that he was eventually sent home. Not exactly an unusual outcome for a boy who had grown up believing he was essentially aristocratic royalty, temporarily inconvenienced by a lack of funds. He treated authority figures with the same mixture of defiance and contempt that he had absorbed watching his father submit to Eppenstein's patronage. He would obey when it suited him, and rebel the moment he felt his dignity was being challenged, which, given his sensitivity on that subject, was approximately every 15 minutes. The one institution that finally managed to channel Göring's aggression and ambition was the military academy at Lichterfelde near Berlin. This was the premier training ground for Prussian officer candidates, the German equivalent of Sandhurst or West Point, and it was, for perhaps the first time in his life, an environment where Göring's qualities were considered virtues rather than problems. Aggression. Excellent. You will need it on the battlefield. Obsession with rank and hierarchy. Perfect. That is literally how armies function. A burning need to prove yourself superior to everyone around you. Welcome to the Prussian officer corps. You will fit right in. Göring thrived at Lichterfelde. He graduated with distinction, received his commission as a lieutenant in the infantry, and stepped into the professional military class with the relief of a man who had finally found the one place on earth where his particular brand of personality was not just tolerated but rewarded. And then, with timing that history seems to have arranged purely for dramatic effect, the world went to war. When the guns of August 1914 opened fire and Europe lurched into the catastrophe of the First World War, Göring was a 21-year-old infantry officer stationed with a regiment near the French border. Like millions of young men across the continent, he marched off to war with enthusiasm, expecting glory, movement, and decisive victory by Christmas. What he got instead was the Western Front, a churning nightmare of mud, barbed wire, artillery barrages, and industrialized slaughter that bore approximately zero resemblance to the chivalric warfare he had been fantasizing about since childhood. The trenches were not battlegrounds for knights. They were mass graves that had not yet been filled. Göring endured the infantry experience for several months, and by all accounts he did so competently. He was brave, aggressive, and willing to take risks that other officers avoided. But competent trench warfare was not what he wanted. The infantry offered survival, maybe a promotion, possibly a medal if you were lucky enough to do something notable without getting obliterated by a shell. What it did not offer was individual glory. In the trenches, you were one body among millions, anonymous, interchangeable, and statistically likely to become a casualty before anyone learned your name. For a man with Göring's psychology, that desperate hunger for recognition, that need to be seen and acknowledged and elevated above the crowd, this was intolerable. He needed something more, something that would let him stand out. He found it in the sky. Aviation in 1914 was still in its infancy. Barely a decade had passed since the Wright brothers had managed to keep a powered aircraft airborne for 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk, and military aviation was viewed by most senior commanders as a novelty at best and a distraction at worst. The generals who ran the war were cavalrymen and artillerymen, products of 19th century military thinking, and they regarded airplanes with roughly the same enthusiasm that a Victorian banker might regard cryptocurrency. Interesting in theory, probably a fad, and certainly not something serious people should invest in. But the young pilots who were actually flying those fragile, unreliable machines above the trenches knew something the generals did not. The future of warfare was in the air, and the men who mastered it would become the new elite. Göring transferred to the air service initially as an observer, the guy who sat in the back seat of a two-seater reconnaissance plane, taking photographs and making notes while someone else did the actual flying. This was still dangerous work, naturally, since early military aircraft had a tendency to fall apart at inconvenient moments, and the enemy had developed an annoying habit of shooting at them. But it was not the starring role Göring was looking for. He wanted to be the pilot. He wanted to be the one in control, and within months he had talked, charmed, and likely bullied his way into flight training. He turned out to be genuinely good at it. Whatever else you might say about Hermann Göring, and there's quite a lot to say, most of it unflattering, the man could fly. He had the reflexes, the spatial awareness, and crucially, the complete absence of caution that early aerial combat demanded. Flying a First World War fighter plane was not like modern aviation. There were no radar systems, no guided missiles, no ejection seats. You sat in an open cockpit, exposed to the wind and the cold and the occasional bullet, and you fought your enemy at close range by pointing your entire aircraft at them and firing a machine gun that was literally bolted to the engine. It required a specific kind of courage, the kind that is difficult to distinguish from recklessness, and Göring had it in abundance. By 1917, he had established himself as one of Germany's leading fighter aces, with a growing tally of confirmed aerial victories. He was decorated, promoted, and transferred to increasingly elite units. And then, in the summer of 1918, he received the appointment that would define the rest of his life: command of Jagdgeschwader 1, better known as the Flying Circus. This was the most famous fighter squadron in the German Air Force, originally commanded by the legendary Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who had been shot down and killed earlier that year. Taking command of Richthofen's unit was the equivalent of being handed a legendary sword by a dying king. It was, in the language of mythology that Göring loved so much, a coronation. And along with the command came the medal. The Pour le Mérite, colloquially known as the Blue Max, was Imperial Germany's highest military decoration for valour, the rough equivalent of the Victoria Cross or the Medal of Honour. When Göring pinned it around his neck, he became a genuine national hero, not a minor noble playing at importance, not a dependent living in someone else's castle, not a difficult child who could not stay in school, a hero. The transformation was complete, at least in his own mind. The awkward boy from Berg-Weldenstein had become the knight he had always pretended to be. But here is the thing about the First World War that gets lost in the mythology of aces and dogfights. Air combat, for all its romantic imagery, was absolutely devastating. The average life expectancy of a new fighter pilot on the Western Front was measured in weeks, not months. Göring survived partly through skill, partly through aggression, and partly through the simple mathematics of luck, enough missions without a fatal bullet finding its mark. He saw friends and comrades disappear on a regular basis, sometimes shot down in flames, sometimes simply failing to return from a patrol with no explanation ever forthcoming. The psychological toll of this was enormous, though Göring, like most men of his generation and class, would never have admitted it. What he took away from the experience was not trauma, or at least not trauma he was willing to acknowledge, but rather a dangerous lesson, that destiny favoured the bold, that personal courage could overcome systemic disadvantage, and that the man willing to take the biggest risk would always come out on top. This was, to put it mildly, not a universally applicable life philosophy, and it would lead him to catastrophic misjudgments later on. But in 1918, with the Blue Max around his neck and the Flying Circus at his command, it felt like the truth. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, and it ended in a way that Germany's military elite found not just devastating but incomprehensible. The armistice was not a negotiated peace between equals. It was a capitulation, a surrender, an admission of defeat that the officer class refused to accept as legitimate. In the mythology that immediately began to grow around the end of the war, Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield. It had been stabbed in the back by civilians, politicians, socialists, and other assorted traitors who had undermined the fighting spirit of the nation, while its soldiers were still holding the line. This stab-in-the-back legend, as historians call it, was nonsense. The German army was exhausted, outnumbered, and running out of supplies by the autumn of 1918, but it was enormously powerful nonsense, and for men like Göring it became an article of faith. The day Göring received orders to surrender his Squadron S aircraft to the Allies was, by several accounts, one of the worst moments of his life. He reportedly ordered his pilots to wreck their own planes rather than hand them over intact, smashing the machines into the ground on landing, an act of defiant sabotage that was both dramatically satisfying and completely pointless. The war was over. The Kaiser had abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The German Empire, that grand, militaristic, hierarchical structure that had given men like Göring their identity, their purpose, and their sense of place in the world, was gone. In its place was something called the Weimar Republic, a democratic experiment that the old military aristocracy regarded with roughly the same enthusiasm as a cat regards a bath. For Göring personally, the end of the war was a catastrophe on every level. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, did not just redraw borders and impose reparations. It dismantled the entire framework of his professional existence. The German military was reduced to 100,000 men, which meant that the vast majority of officers were suddenly unemployed. The Air Force was abolished entirely. Göring's rank, his command, his medals, none of it translated into a peacetime career. He was 26 years old, a decorated war hero, and he had absolutely no marketable skills outside of flying a fighter plane, which was not a profession that the new Germany had much use for. What followed was a period of drift that lasted nearly a decade, and it is during these years that you can watch Göring's radicalization happen in something close to real time. Stripped of his military identity, cut off from the social structures that had given his life meaning, and unwilling to accept the legitimacy of the new democratic order, he became what we might today call a broken veteran, though he would have rejected that description violently. He left Germany and wandered across northern Europe, picking up work wherever he could find it. In Denmark, he performed aerial stunts at air shows, essentially doing tricks in a biplane for paying audiences, which for a former commander of the flying circus must have felt roughly equivalent to a retired symphony conductor being reduced to playing accordion on street corners. In Sweden, he flew commercial routes for a small airline, ferrying passengers and mail between cities in a peacetime occupation that had none of the glory or danger he craved. It was in Sweden that he met Karin von Kantzow, born Baroness Karin von Fock, a Swedish aristocrat who was already married with a young son when Göring appeared in her life. Their relationship was intense, dramatic, and, in the social conventions of 1920s Scandinavian high society, scandalous. Karin left her husband for Göring, and they married in 1923 after her divorce was finalised. For Göring, this marriage was more than a love match, though by most accounts genuine affection was involved. Karin represented everything he had lost and everything he wanted to reclaim: aristocratic lineage, social respectability, a connection to the European upper class that his own family's decline had severed. Through Karin, he could reimagine himself not as a broke ex-pilot doing airshow tricks for pocket change, but as a man of standing, temporarily displaced by circumstances but destined to return to his rightful position. She was, in a sense, both his wife and his mirror, reflecting back the version of himself he needed to see. But Sweden was not Germany, and no amount of aristocratic marriage could fill the void that the collapse of the empire had left in Göring's identity. He missed Germany, or rather he missed the Germany that no longer existed, the imperial Germany of military parades, rigid class hierarchies, and unquestioned national strength. The Weimar Republic, with its parliamentary democracy, its cultural liberalism, its tolerance of dissent and diversity, was everything Göring despised. It was, in his view, not just a bad government, but an illegitimate one. A regime imposed on Germany by its enemies and maintained by the very people who had supposedly betrayed the nation in 1918. He followed German politics obsessively from abroad, and what he saw confirmed every prejudice he already held. The economy lurched from crisis to crisis. Hyperinflation destroyed the savings of the middle class. Street battles between communists and nationalists turned cities into battlegrounds, and the political establishment seemed incapable of providing either stability or direction. During these years of exile, Göring's worldview hardened into something that was no longer just conservative or nationalist, but genuinely radical. He did not simply want to reform the Weimar Republic. He wanted to destroy it and replace it with something that looked much more like the old empire, but stronger, more aggressive, and more willing to use force to achieve its aims. The problem was that he had no vehicle for this ambition. He was a man without a party, without a movement, without a country that wanted him back. Germany had issued warrants related to some of his activities during the chaotic post-war period, and for years he was effectively persona non grata in his own homeland. He was stuck, talented, ambitious, furious, and completely powerless. There was also the morphine addiction, which we will come to when we reach the events that caused it. For now, it is enough to say that the years of exile broke Göring in ways that went beyond unemployment and wounded pride. It is worth pausing here to note something that often gets lost in biographies of powerful people, especially powerful people who go on to do terrible things. There was a moment during these wandering years when Hermann Göring was simply a sad, broken, addicted man living in a foreign country, estranged from his homeland, dependent on his wife's family for support, and showing no obvious signs that he would ever amount to anything again. History has a way of making the rise of dangerous figures seem inevitable, as though some dark destiny was always guiding them toward power. But the truth is usually messier and more contingent than that. In 1926, Göring was not a future field marshal or a future war criminal. He was a morphine addict in a Swedish clinic, and there was no particular reason to believe his story would end anywhere other than in obscurity. But it did not end in obscurity, because in 1927, Germany granted a general amnesty for political offences related to the post-war upheavals, and Göring was finally able to return home. The man who stepped off the train in Munich was different from the war hero who had left nearly a decade earlier, heavier, older, carrying the invisible weight of addiction and exile. But the core drives were the same, only more intense for having been frustrated for so long. He wanted status, he wanted power, he wanted revenge on the system that had discarded him and the people he blamed for Germany's humiliation, and he was willing to attach himself to absolutely anyone who could help him get those things. The Germany he returned to was a country in a state of perpetual crisis, and that crisis was the oxygen that extremist movements breathed. The Weimar Republic's brief period of relative stability in the mid-1920s was already showing cracks. The economy was propped up by American loans that could be withdrawn at any moment. The political centre was shrinking as voters drifted toward radical parties on both the left and right, and the old elites, the industrialists, the military officers, the aristocrats, were increasingly willing to consider anti-democratic alternatives if those alternatives promised to restore their power and protect their wealth. Into this volatile landscape walked Göring, a decorated veteran with aristocratic connections, a burning grievance against the Republic, and no particular ideological commitments beyond nationalism and a desire for personal advancement. He had already met the man who would give him his vehicle. Back in 1922, before the exile, before the addiction, before the years of wandering, Göring had attended a political rally in Munich and heard a speaker who, for all his obvious vulgarity and lack of breeding, seemed to be saying exactly what Göring wanted to hear. The speaker's name was Adolf Hitler, and what he was offering was simple, powerful, and intoxicating. The complete destruction of the Weimar Republic, the restoration of German military power, the punishment of everyone responsible for the nation's defeat and humiliation, and the creation of a new Germany that would be stronger, purer, and more dominant than anything that had come before. For Göring, who had spent years nursing exactly these grievances in exile, it was like hearing his own internal monologue delivered through a megaphone. But we will get to that meeting, and everything that came after it in due course. For now, what matters is understanding the man as he was before the politics, before the uniforms, before the power and the crimes. Hermann Göring at the end of the 1920s was a product of very specific historical forces. The decline of the Prussian aristocracy, the trauma of the First World War, the humiliation of Versailles, the chaos of Weimar, but he was also a product of his own psychology. The childhood spent in someone else's castle, the father's impotence, the mother's compromise, the desperate need to be somebody that had driven him since boyhood. These forces did not make his future crimes inevitable. Nothing in history is inevitable. But they created a man who was extraordinarily vulnerable to the appeal of a movement that promised to restore everything he had lost and punish everyone he blamed for losing it. The kindling was stacked. It was just waiting for a match. The match, as it turned out, came in the form of a man who could not have been more different from Göring in almost every superficial respect. Where Göring was tall, broad, decorated and aristocratic, at least in his own estimation. Adolf Hitler in 1922 was a scrawny, intense, lower-middle-class Austrian with a patchy employment history, no military rank worth mentioning, and a moustache that even by the generous grooming standards of the era was making some choices. He had never commanded troops, never attended a military academy, never received anything close to the pour le mérite. His wartime service had been as a corporal, a message runner in the trenches, which in the hierarchy of military prestige ranked somewhere between admirable and invisible. On paper, these two men should have had absolutely nothing in common. In practice, they were about to form one of the most consequential political partnerships of the 20th century, which really tells you everything you need to know about how politics actually works. Göring first heard Hitler speak at a rally in Munich in November 1922. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, though at this point they were still a fringe Bavarian movement that most serious people treated as a bad joke, had been gaining attention in Munich's overheated political atmosphere, and Hitler was its undeniable star attraction. His speeches were not what you would call intellectually sophisticated. They were long, repetitive, emotionally manipulative, and built around a handful of simple themes hammered home with relentless intensity. Germany had been betrayed, the Weimar Republic was illegitimate, the Jews and the communists were to blame, and only a radical national rebirth could save the fatherland. Subtlety was not on the menu, but what Hitler lacked in nuance he made up for in raw emotional power. He had an almost supernatural ability to read a crowd, to find the frequency of their anger and resentment, and to amplify it until the entire room was vibrating with shared fury. It was manipulation, certainly, but it was manipulation of the highest order, and Göring, who had spent years nursing exactly the same resentments Hitler was articulating, was utterly captivated. What Göring heard in that Munich beer hall was not just a political program. It was a promise that the old Germany, the imperial, militaristic, hierarchical Germany that had given him his identity and his purpose, could be rebuilt, that the humiliation of Versailles could be reversed, that the men who had served and sacrificed in the war would be honoured again, elevated again, given back the power and status that the Republic had stripped from them. For a man who had spent the previous 4 years wandering through Scandinavia, performing airshow tricks and marrying into Swedish aristocracy while his own country fell apart, this was exactly the kind of vision that could pull him out of exile and back into the fight. He approached Hitler after the rally and offered his services. For Hitler, the timing could not have been better, and Göring's offer could not have been more valuable. The Nazi Party in 1922 was, to put it diplomatically, not an organisation that inspired confidence in polite society. Its membership consisted largely of disgruntled veterans, unemployed workers, street brawlers, and assorted political radicals who were long on rage and short on respectability. Hitler needed someone who could bridge the gap between the beer hall and the boardroom, someone who could walk into a room full of bankers or generals and not immediately make them reach for the nearest exit. Göring was that someone. He had a noble name, a war record that commanded genuine respect, the highest military decoration in Germany hanging around his neck, and the social graces of a man raised, however awkwardly, among the aristocracy. He was, in Hitler's eyes, a walking advertisement for the idea that National Socialism was not just a movement for thugs and malcontents, but a cause that serious, distinguished men of good breeding could support. The fact that Göring's good breeding was largely a fiction maintained by Eppenstein. Money was, naturally, not something either man felt the need to discuss. Hitler gave Göring command of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Party's paramilitary wing, and this was where Göring's organisational abilities, such as they were, received their first serious test. The SA in late 1922 was less a military organisation and more a loose collection of Freikorps veterans, street fighters, and assorted angry young men who liked wearing brown shirts and getting into brawls with communists. Discipline was optional, strategy was non-existent. The average SA man's idea of political action was to show up at an opponent's rally, start a fight, and then retreat to a bar to celebrate their contribution to the national cause. This was not, to put it mildly, the kind of fighting force that could overthrow a government. Göring set about changing that with the energy of a man who had finally been given a job he understood. He imposed military-style drill and hierarchy on the SA, organised them into units with proper chains of command, and began training them, not just to brawl, but to march, to follow orders, and to look like something more than a mob when they assembled in public. He was good at this. The skills he had learned at Lichterfelde and honed in the air war, discipline, aggression, the ability to command men through force of personality, translated surprisingly well to the task of turning political hooligans into something resembling soldiers. Within a year, the SA had been transformed from an embarrassment into an asset, a paramilitary force that could march through Munich in formation and actually look intimidating rather than merely drunk. This transformation had consequences that went far beyond aesthetics. Hitler, watching the SA swell in numbers and improve in discipline under Göring's leadership, began to believe that he had the muscle to attempt something dramatic. The Weimar Republic was weak, the Bavarian state government was sympathetic to right-wing causes, and the army, the real army, the Reichswehr, was filled with officers who privately shared the Nazis' contempt for democracy. If the conditions were right, if the timing was perfect, if enough people could be convinced or coerced into joining, a bold strike at the government might just succeed. The French had just occupied the Ruhr industrial region in January 1923 over unpaid reparations, and the resulting economic chaos, hyperinflation so severe that workers were being paid twice a day because their wages lost value between morning and afternoon, had pushed public fury to a boiling point. Hitler looked at all of this and decided the moment had arrived. The beer hall putsch of November 8th and 9th, 1923 was the result, and it deserves to be remembered not as the bold revolutionary stroke its participants imagined, but as one of the most spectacularly bungled political operations in modern European history. The plan, such as it was, involved seizing control of a large political rally at the Bürgerbräukeller, a massive beer hall in Munich where Bavarian state officials were giving speeches. Hitler and his allies would burst in, announce that the national revolution had begun, compel the Bavarian leadership to support them at gunpoint, and then march on Berlin to topple the federal government. If this sounds like the kind of plan that a group of overconfident men might come up with after several hours of drinking, that is because it essentially was. The level of strategic planning involved would have been considered inadequate for organising a company picnic, let alone a coup d'etat. On the evening of November 8th, Hitler did indeed burst into the Bürgerbräukeller, fired a pistol into the ceiling to get everyone's attention, a technique that is both highly effective and strongly inadvisable in most social situations, and declared that the national revolution was underway. Göring, standing at his side, announced to the bewildered crowd that this was not a cause for alarm and that they should remain calm, finish their beer and await further instructions. The Bavarian officials present, Gustav von Kahr, Otto von Lossow, and Hans Ritter von Seisser, were taken to a back room and pressured into pledging their support for the uprising. They agreed because there was a man with a gun in the room, and then promptly reneged on their promises the moment they were out of Hitler's sight, because agreeing to things at gunpoint tends not to produce lasting political commitments. What followed the next morning was a disaster. Hitler, Göring, and roughly 2,000 armed supporters attempted to march through central Munich to rally public support and seize key government buildings. The police and military, far from joining the revolution as Hitler had hoped, set up a defensive line at the Feldherrenhalle and opened fire when the marchers refused to stop. The entire confrontation lasted less than a minute. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed. Hitler threw himself to the ground, or was pulled down by a comrade depending on whose account you believe, and dislocated his shoulder. He fled the scene in a car and was arrested 2 days later at a supporteress house, hiding in a wardrobe, which was not exactly the image of fearless revolutionary leadership he had been cultivating. Göring's experience was considerably worse. He was hit by a bullet during the shooting at the Feldherrenhalle, taking a round to the upper thigh and groin area, an injury that was both excruciatingly painful and, in the peculiar logic of masculine pride, deeply humiliating to discuss. Bleeding heavily, he was dragged to safety by supporters and taken to a nearby house where he received basic first aid from a Jewish family, a detail that history has preserved with the kind of pointed irony that no novelist would dare invent. He was then smuggled across the Austrian border to avoid arrest, and it was in Austria during the long and agonizing recovery from his wound that his morphine dependency took root. The putsch was over. It had failed completely. 16 men were dead for nothing. Hitler was in prison, where he would spend the next year writing Mein Kampf and refining his strategy from violent revolution to legal political conquest. And Göring was in Austria, transitioning from war hero to drug addict, from revolutionary leader to fugitive, from the commander of the flying circus to a man who could not get through a day without an injection of morphine. The Austrian years were, by any measure, the lowest point of his life. His weight ballooned. His mood swung violently between euphoria and rage. His marriage to Karin, who had followed him into exile with a loyalty that exceeded what the circumstances probably warranted, was strained by his addiction, his poverty, and his increasingly erratic behaviour. He was committed to a psychiatric facility in Sweden, and the medical records from this period describe a patient who was aggressive, paranoid, and subject to violent outbursts that required physical restraint. It is tempting, from the comfortable distance of a century, to look at this moment and think, this should have been the end. This is where the story of Hermann Göring should have petered out. A footnote in the history of a failed coup, a cautionary tale about a decorated veteran who lost his way, perhaps a brief mention in a medical textbook about the dangers of opioid dependency. But history, unfortunately, is not in the business of tidy endings, and the Weimar Republic was about to provide exactly the conditions that would allow Göring, and men like him, to claw their way back from oblivion. With the amnesty secured and the Weimar Republic crumbling in exactly the ways we have already described, Göring's return to Germany coincided perfectly with the moment when the old elites were desperate for a political force to protect them, and the role he carved out for himself was nothing short of brilliant. Because here is the thing that most people get wrong about the Nazi rise to power. They think it was all about Hitler's speeches and the brown shirts in the streets. That was part of it, certainly, and the rallies, the propaganda, the intimidation, the sheer theatrical spectacle of National Socialism was essential to building a mass movement. But mass movements do not take over modern states by themselves. They need money, they need connections. They need access to the corridors of power where real decisions are made, far from the roaring crowds and the torchlight parades, and that is where Göring came in. After returning to Germany, Göring did not rejoin the SA or throw himself back into street-level politics. Instead, he put on his best suit, his best civilian clothes, though he would have preferred a uniform, and began working the salons, the dinner parties, the private clubs, and the corporate boardrooms of the German upper class. His pitch was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective. National Socialism, he told anyone who would listen, was not the rabble it appeared to be. Yes, there were rough elements. Yes, the rhetoric could be strident. But at its core, the movement was a bulwark against Bolshevism, a force for national renewal, a party that understood the importance of private property, industrial strength, and social hierarchy. It was, he assured the bankers and the barons and the factory owners, a movement they could do business with. This was not entirely a lie, which is what made it so effective. The Nazi Party did genuinely oppose communism, violently so. It did promise to restore German military power and national pride, which the industrial elite favoured because rearmament meant lucrative government contracts. And it did offer a vision of social order that, while radical in some respects, preserved the basic structure of capitalism and class privilege that the wealthy depended upon. What Göring carefully omitted from his sales pitch, naturally, were the other elements of the Nazi programme: the racial ideology, the eliminationist anti-Semitism, the plans for territorial conquest, the fundamental contempt for the rule of law that would eventually make the party's true nature impossible to ignore. But in 1928, with the communists gaining seats in parliament and the economy showing signs of strain, the German elite was not particularly interested in reading the fine print. They wanted protection, and Göring was offering it. In 1928, Göring won a seat in the Reichstag as one of the Nazi Party S12 parliamentary representatives, a tiny fraction of the total, but a foothold. 4 years later, after the Great Depression had devastated the German economy and sent unemployment soaring past 6 million, the Nazis won 230 seats and became the largest party in parliament. Göring was elected president of the Reichstag, which made him the third highest-ranking official in the Weimar Republic, the very republic he was actively working to destroy. The irony was not lost on anyone who was paying attention, though unfortunately not enough people were paying attention. As Reichstag president, Göring used his position with a combination of procedural ruthlessness and social charm that his opponents consistently underestimated. In Parliament, he manipulated debates, silenced opposition speakers on technicalities, and ensured that the Nazi agenda received disproportionate airtime. Outside Parliament, he continued his campaign of elite seduction, hosting lavish gatherings at his Berlin apartment, where industrialists like Fritz Thyssen, bankers, and old money aristocrats could meet Nazi leaders in an environment that felt less like a political rally and more like a cocktail party. The message was always the same: we are civilized people, we share your concerns, and we can be trusted with power. It was, in essence, the most consequential confidence trick in European political history, and Göring was its primary operator. The role suited him perfectly, and it is important to understand why. Göring was not, at his core, an ideologue. He did not stay up late reading racial theory, or debating the finer points of anti-Semitic philosophy. He was a pragmatist, an opportunist, if you prefer the less flattering term, whose primary interest was power and the status that came with it. He believed in German greatness, certainly, and he harboured the standard prejudices of his class and generation, but his commitment to National Socialism was always more instrumental than ideological. He was loyal to Hitler personally, in the way that a man is loyal to the patron who gives him everything he wants. But the deeper currents of Nazi ideology, the mystical racial theories, the pseudo-scientific obsession with blood and soil, the apocalyptic vision of civilizational struggle, interested him mainly as tools for acquiring and maintaining power. This made him enormously useful to the party, because he could present its face to the world without being encumbered by its more disturbing convictions. A true believer might have let the mask slip during a dinner with a skeptical industrialist. Göring never did, because for him the mask was the point. The critical period was the winter of 1932 to 1933, when the question of whether Hitler would actually become Chancellor hung in the balance. The political manoeuvring during these months was extraordinarily complex, a tangle of backroom deals, broken promises, personal rivalries, and miscalculations that historians have spent decades untangling. But Göring's role was central. He served as the Nazi Party's primary negotiator with President Hindenburg's inner circle, with conservative politicians like Franz von Papen, who believed they could use Hitler as a tool and then discard him, and with military leaders who wanted guarantees about rearmament. Göring moved between these worlds with an ease that none of his party comrades could match. Hitler could electrify a stadium but could not make small talk with a general over brandy. Goebbels was too transparently fanatical. Rome was too obviously thuggish. Only Göring could sit in a room with the old guard and make them feel that inviting the Nazis into government was not just safe, but sensible. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The conservative politicians who had engineered this arrangement congratulated themselves on their cleverness. They had boxed Hitler in, they believed, surrounded him with experienced conservative ministers, and ensured that the Nazi leader would be a figurehead while they pulled the real strings. This assessment proved to be, by a considerable margin, the worst political miscalculation in the history of the Weimar Republic, which is saying something given that the Weimar Republic's entire history was essentially a series of political miscalculations stacked on top of each other. Within months, Hitler had dismantled every restraint they had placed on him, banned opposition parties, suspended civil liberties, and begun the construction of a totalitarian state. And Göring was right there beside him, having delivered exactly what he promised: the keys to the establishment. The decorated pilot, the morphine addict, the exile, the salesman in a good suit. All of these versions of Göring had been leading to this moment. He had taken a fringe movement of beer hall radicals and made it palatable to the people who actually controlled Germany's wealth and institutions. Whether he understood what he was unleashing is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is that without his particular combination of social access, personal charm and moral flexibility, the path from Munich beer hall to Berlin Chancellery would have been considerably longer and far less certain. Göring had not just joined the party, he had opened the door through which it walked into power, smiled at the doorman, and assured everyone inside that the guests were perfectly respectable. The fact that the guests then proceeded to set the house on fire was, apparently, not something he had fully anticipated, or perhaps not something he particularly cared about, as long as he got to keep the nicest room for himself. The door was open, the guests had walked through it, and now it was time to redecorate. Within weeks of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the new regime began consolidating power at a speed that left its opponents, and quite a few of its allies, struggling to keep up. And nobody moved faster than Göring. While Hitler was still settling into the Chancellery and figuring out which drawers held the stationery, Göring was already building the machinery of control that would make the Nazi state not just a government, but a system of total dominance. He had waited over a decade for this moment, through exile, addiction, humiliation, and the long, patient game of salon diplomacy. And he was not about to waste it on ceremonial duties and ribbon cutting. His first acquisition was Prussia. As part of the coalition deal that brought Hitler to power, Göring was appointed Minister of the Interior for the state of Prussia, which was, by a considerable margin, the most important political appointment that most people have never heard of. Prussia was not just any German state. It was the largest, the most populous, the most industrialized, and, crucially, the state that contained Berlin. Controlling Prussia as interior ministry meant controlling its police force, which was the largest in Germany. It meant controlling who got arrested and who did not, who got investigated and who got left alone, which political meetings were permitted and which were shut down. In a country that was still nominally a democracy, with opposition parties still technically legal, and newspapers still theoretically free, control of the Prussian police was worth more than a dozen cabinet seats. Göring understood this immediately, which suggests that whatever his failings as a military strategist, his instincts as a political operator were genuinely first-rate. His first move was a personnel purge so thorough that it would have made a corporate restructuring consultant weep with admiration. Within weeks of taking office, Göring replaced 14 of Prussia's 15 police chiefs with loyal Nazis or sympathetic conservatives. Senior officers who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the new regime were retired, transferred to irrelevant positions, or simply fired. In their place came men whose primary qualification was not policing experience but political reliability. SA leaders, party veterans, ideological true believers who understood that their job was not to enforce the law impartially, but to enforce the will of the party selectively. The distinction between law enforcement and political enforcement, which had never been especially robust in Weimar Germany, effectively ceased to exist. The police did not serve the public. They served the regime, and the regime increasingly meant Göring. But a conventional police force, however politically compliant, was not enough for what Göring had in mind. What he wanted was something new, an organisation dedicated specifically to the identification, surveillance, and elimination of political enemies, operating outside the normal legal framework, answerable to no court and no legislature, and limited only by the instructions of its masters. In April 1933 he created exactly that. The Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, was established by executive decree, carved out of the existing Prussian political police and reorganized into an independent agency with sweeping powers of arrest, detention, and interrogation. Its abbreviation, Gestapo, would become one of the most feared words in the 20th century, and Göring was its founding architect. The Gestapo's early operations were focused primarily on communists, social democrats, trade union leaders, and other political opponents of the regime, essentially anyone who might organize effective resistance to the Nazi takeover. The Reichstag fire of February 27, 1933, which occurred barely a month after Hitler became Chancellor, and which the Nazis blamed on a communist conspiracy, though the question of who actually set the fire remains debated to this day, provided the perfect pretext. Göring used the emergency decree that followed the fire to authorize mass arrests, raids on opposition party offices, and the suspension of basic civil liberties including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assembly. Thousands of people were detained in the weeks that followed, many of them held in improvised detention facilities, abandoned factories, SA barracks, empty warehouses, where they were subjected to beatings, intimidation, and what the regime euphemistically described as enhanced interrogation. These ad hoc detention centres were, in effect, the prototypes for the concentration camp system that would later expand to horrifying scale. It is worth noting the speed at which all of this happened, because the velocity of the Nazi consolidation of power is one of its most instructive features. Between January 30th, when Hitler became Chancellor, and March 23rd, when the Reichstag passed the enabling act that effectively ended parliamentary democracy in Germany, less than 2 months had elapsed. In those 8 weeks, Göring had purged the Prussian police, created the Gestapo, used the Reichstag fire to justify mass arrests, and helped organize an election campaign that, backed by state violence and media manipulation, gave the Nazis enough seats to pass legislation granting Hitler the power to rule by decree. The opposition parties, the trade unions, the free press, the independent judiciary, all the institutions that might have resisted, were either destroyed, co-opted, or paralysed by the sheer pace of events. By the time anyone fully understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the period. Authoritarian takeovers do not always announce themselves with tanks in the streets. Sometimes they arrive in the form of emergency decrees, personnel changes and legal technicalities, implemented so quickly that the system collapses before it can mount a defense. Göring ran the Gestapo for its first year with characteristic energy and characteristic carelessness. He was better at creating organizations than at managing them, a pattern that would repeat throughout his career. And the Gestapo under his direct leadership was effective but chaotic, driven more by personal vendettas and political opportunity than by systematic strategy. He used it to settle scores, to intimidate rivals within the Nazi Party as well as outside it, and to build a personal intelligence network that gave him leverage over virtually everyone in the regime. But he lacked the patience and the methodical temperament required to turn the Gestapo into the kind of totalitarian surveillance apparatus that the regime ultimately needed. That job would eventually fall to Heinrich Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich, who took control of the Gestapo in April 1934 and transformed it from Göring's personal political weapon into the centerpiece of the SS security state. Göring surrendered the Gestapo reluctantly. He did not enjoy giving up any of his toys, but he was already distracted by a much shinier prize. That prize was the Luftwaffe. If the Gestapo represented Göring's talent for political manipulation, the Air Force represented his deepest personal passion, and ultimately his most consequential failure. The Treaty of Versailles had explicitly forbidden Germany from maintaining a military air force, and for over a decade the country had officially complied, at least on paper. In reality, Germany had been secretly training pilots and developing aircraft technology throughout the 1920s, using covert programs in the Soviet Union and civilian aviation companies as cover. By the time the Nazis came to power, the infrastructure for a rapid air force build-up was already in place, waiting only for a government willing to openly defy the treaty. That government had arrived, and Göring, the former commander of the Flying Circus, the holder of the Blue Max, the man who had dreamed of returning to the sky since the day he was forced to wreck his own planes in 1918, was the obvious choice to lead the effort. In March 1935, the existence of the Luftwaffe was officially announced to the world, and Göring was named its commander-in-chief. The announcement was a calculated provocation, a deliberate public violation of the Versailles Treaty, designed to test whether the Western powers would respond with anything more than diplomatic protests. They did not. Britain, France, and the other Allied nations issued strongly worded statements of concern, held meetings, exchanged notes, and ultimately did nothing of substance to prevent German rearmament. This pattern, outrageous provocation followed by ineffectual international response, would repeat itself with depressing regularity over the next 4 years, each time emboldening the Nazi regime to push further. For Göring personally, the lack of consequences confirmed what he had always believed, that boldness was its own reward and that the democracies were too weak and too divided to stand in Germany's way. The early Luftwaffe was, in many respects, a reflection of its commander's personality, impressive on the surface, flashy in presentation, and worryingly short on substance underneath. Göring threw himself into the project with the enthusiasm of a man finally living out his childhood fantasy. But his approach to building an air force was, shall we say, more aesthetic than analytical. He was obsessed with numbers, how many planes Germany could produce, how many squadrons could be formed, how impressive the statistics would look in reports to Hitler, and considerably less interested in the unglamorous work of logistics, training infrastructure, maintenance systems, and strategic doctrine that actually determines whether an air force can fight a sustained war. He wanted the Luftwaffe to look formidable, and in the mid-1930s, it did. Whether it actually was formidable was a question that would not be answered until the bombs started falling. His management style did not help. Göring approached leadership the way he approached everything else in life, through personal relationships, gut instinct, and an unshakable confidence in his own judgment that bore diminishing relation to the quality of that judgment over time. He promoted officers based on loyalty rather than ability, a tendency that had served him well in the political arena, but was considerably less useful when the question was not, who can flatter me most effectively, but who can design an effective fighter interceptor program. He surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear, and he reacted to bad news with rage rather than analysis. Technical experts who tried to warn him about production bottlenecks, design flaws, or strategic vulnerabilities found themselves transferred, demoted, or simply ignored. The message was clear. The Commander-in-Chief preferred optimistic reports to accurate ones, and the officer corps adjusted accordingly. One of the most consequential decisions of this early period was Göring's approach to aircraft design and production philosophy. Rather than focusing on a small number of proven mass-producible designs, which was what Britain would later do with devastating effectiveness through aircraft like the Spitfire and the Hurricane, Göring encouraged a proliferation of experimental programs, prototype competitions, and prestige projects that spread resources thin and created bottlenecks in production. He was drawn to impressive specifications on paper, speed records, altitude records, range figures that looked good in presentations, rather than the boring but critical question of whether a given aircraft could be manufactured quickly, maintained easily, and flown competently by average pilots rather than elite test crews. This was not a problem that manifested immediately. In the mid-1930s, when the Luftwaffe was still building up and had not yet been tested in a major conflict, the emphasis on showcase technology and impressive numbers was enough to create the desired effect, an air force that looked, from the outside, like the most powerful in Europe. The reckoning would come later. There was also the matter of strategic doctrine, or rather, the lack of it. Air power theory in the 1930s was dominated by two competing schools of thought. One, associated with Italian theorist Giulio Douhet and his followers, argued that the primary purpose of an air force was strategic bombing, the destruction of an enemy's industrial capacity, infrastructure, and civilian morale through sustained aerial bombardment of cities and factories. The other school emphasized tactical air power, the use of aircraft in direct support of ground forces, attacking enemy troops, supply lines, and defensive positions in coordination with advancing armies. These two approaches required very different types of aircraft, very different training programs, and very different organizational structures, and the choice between them had profound implications for how an air force would perform in actual combat. Göring, characteristically, never fully committed to either approach. The Luftwaffe under his command was designed as a tactical air force, optimized for short, sharp campaigns in support of ground operations, but it was sold to Hitler and the German public as a strategic force capable of bringing any enemy to its knees through air power alone. This gap between capability and rhetoric would prove catastrophic when the time came to actually deliver on the promises. The Luftwaffe had excellent tactical bombers and dive bombers. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, with its terrifying siren, became the iconic symbol of blitzkrieg, but it never developed a true heavy bomber capable of sustained strategic bombing campaigns against distant targets. When Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could bomb Britain into submission or supply an entire army by air at Stalingrad, he was making commitments that his air force was physically incapable of fulfilling. But those failures lay in the future, and in the mid-1930s the future was something Göring preferred not to think about too carefully. What he preferred to think about was his own magnificence, and this is where the personal and the political become almost impossible to separate. Göring's approach to his role as Luftwaffe commander was inseparable from his approach to his own image. He designed elaborate uniforms for himself, pale blue tunics with gold braid, white dress uniforms for summer, hunting-themed outfits for informal occasions, and changed them with a frequency that suggested he viewed getting dressed less as a morning routine and more as a theatrical production. He awarded himself medals and decorations with a generosity that would have embarrassed a less shameless man, including the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, which he wore on a chain around his neck at a size that bordered on parody. He gave himself the title of Reichsmarschall, a rank that had not existed in the German military before, and that was created specifically to place him above every other officer in all three branches of the armed forces. Unsurprisingly, the actual generals and admirals who had spent their careers earning their stars through professional competence were less than thrilled to find themselves outranked by a man whose primary military qualification at this point was owning a very large collection of fancy outfits. But beneath the costumes and the self-awarded honours, something genuinely dangerous was taking shape. The Luftwaffe, for all its organisational flaws, was a real military force with real destructive capability, and the Gestapo, even after Göring handed it to Himmler, had established a template for political repression that the regime would refine and expand over the following years. Göring had built two of the three essential pillars of the Nazi state, the secret police apparatus that crushed internal dissent, and the air force that would project military power beyond Germany's borders. The third pillar, the economic system that would finance rearmament and eventually conquest, was about to become his responsibility as well, and it would reveal yet another dimension of his character. Not just the vain commander or the cunning politician, but the predatory economic opportunist who would turn an entire continent's wealth into his personal treasure chest. He was finally building an empire of his own, and the construction costs would be measured not in marks but in human lives. The treasure chest, as it turned out, was an entire national economy. In October 1936, Hitler appointed Göring as the head of the 4-year plan, an economic program designed to make Germany self-sufficient in strategic raw materials and ready for war within, naturally, 4 years. On paper, this was an industrial policy initiative, the kind of thing that sounds dry enough to cure insomnia. In practice, it made Göring the most powerful economic figure in the country, with authority that superseded existing government ministries, overrode private industry, and answered to no one except Hitler himself. The man who had spent his childhood dependent on another person's wealth, who had drifted through the 1920s without 2 marks to rub together, was now in charge of the economic output of one of the largest industrial nations on Earth. If there is a more reliable formula for producing a kleptocrat, economics has yet to identify it. To understand what Göring did with this power, you first have to understand what the German economy looked like in the mid-1930s, and the answer is complicated, fragile, and already deeply distorted by 3 years of Nazi rule. The regime had achieved impressive headline numbers, unemployment had dropped dramatically, industrial output was rising, the autobahns were being built, but underneath these figures was a reality that was considerably less reassuring. The economic recovery was fueled almost entirely by deficit spending on rearmament, which meant the government was borrowing enormous sums to build weapons, tanks, and aircraft, while consumer goods, housing, and civilian infrastructure were systematically starved of investment. Germany was, in effect, running up a massive credit card bill on the assumption that future military conquests would provide the resources to pay it off. This is not, it should be noted, a strategy that any reputable financial advisor would recommend. But then again, the Nazi regime was not in the habit of consulting reputable financial advisors. Göring's predecessor in managing the economy, Hjalmar Schacht, had been a genuine financial professional. The former president of the Reichsbank, a man who understood monetary policy, international trade, and the limits of what a national economy could sustain without collapsing. Schacht had performed the considerable feat of financing the early rearmament program through creative financial instruments, most famously the MEFO bills, a kind of government IOU that deferred the cost of military spending into the future. But by 1936, he was increasingly alarmed by the pace of spending and the regime's refusal to accept any economic constraints on its ambitions. Schacht wanted guns now, and butter later, but he at least acknowledged that the butter would have to come at some point. Göring had no such concerns. His approach to economics could be summarized as, take whatever you need, from whoever has it, and worry about the consequences never. It was, in a sense, the economic philosophy of a man who remembered what it felt like to depend on someone else's generosity. Wealth was something that other people created, and that you, if you were bold enough, simply took. The 4-year plan office became, under Göring's direction, a sprawling bureaucratic empire that inserted itself into virtually every aspect of German economic life. New regulations, licensing requirements, allocation controls and production mandates multiplied at a rate that would have impressed even the most enthusiastic modern regulator. Every business needed permits, every raw material was rationed, every import and export required approval, and at every point where a decision was made, where a license was granted or denied, where materials were allocated or withheld, where a contract was awarded or cancelled, there was an opportunity for someone with the right connections to extract a payment. Corruption was not a bug in this system, it was the operating principle. The entire structure was designed, whether intentionally or through the natural logic of concentrated power, to create bottlenecks that could only be cleared by greasing the right palms, and the rightest palm of all belonged to the man at the top. Göring enriched himself through this system, with a thoroughness that was impressive even by the standards of authoritarian regimes, which is a category of governance not typically known for financial restraint. He took direct payments from industrialists seeking favourable treatment. He received gifts, art, jewellery, property, hunting estates, From businessmen who understood that generosity toward the head of the 4-year plan tended to produce favourable regulatory outcomes. He inserted himself into business deals as a silent partner, taking a cut of profits from enterprises that owed their existence to his patronage, and he used his position to acquire assets at below-market prices, leveraging state power to negotiate terms that no private buyer could have commanded. The line between state economic policy and personal enrichment did not blur under Göring's management. It simply ceased to exist. But the most systematic form of theft was not the bribes or the backroom deals. It was the legal state-sanctioned expropriation of Jewish property, and this is where Göring's economic role intersected with the regime's racial ideology, in a way that reveals something important about how the Nazi system actually functioned. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had already stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship and imposed sweeping restrictions on their economic activities. Göring, in his capacity as economic overlord, took these legal frameworks and weaponized them into a comprehensive system of dispossession. The process had a name, Aryanization, and it worked with a bureaucratic efficiency that makes it all the more disturbing. Jewish-owned businesses were forced to sell to non-Jewish buyers, but the sales were not conducted at market value. They were conducted at prices dictated by the state, which meant prices dictated by Nazi officials, which meant prices that amounted to a fraction of what the businesses were actually worth. A factory that had taken a family 3 generations to build might be sold for 10 or 20% of its real value, with the difference vanishing into the pockets of the party functionaries who brokered the deal. Sometimes the businesses were simply confiscated outright, with no compensation at all. The legal framework existed not to protect the rights of the sellers, who had no rights, but to create a veneer of legitimacy that made the theft look like a transaction. It was robbery with paperwork, and Göring sat at the top of the paperwork pile. The scale of this expropriation was staggering. By the end of 1938, roughly 60 to 70% of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany had been Aryanized, transferred to non-Jewish owners under terms that amounted to legalized confiscation. The proceeds flowed in multiple directions. Some went to the state treasury to fund rearmament, some went to the party loyalists and connected industrialists who acquired the businesses at bargain prices, and a significant portion simply disappeared into the personal accounts and collections of senior Nazi officials. Göring was the biggest beneficiary, not necessarily because he stole more than anyone else in absolute terms, but because his position at the intersection of economic policy and political power gave him first pick of everything worth taking. This brings us to a point that deserves emphasis, because it is frequently misunderstood in popular accounts of the Nazi regime. Göring's anti-Semitism was real. He shared the prejudices of his class and his political movement, and he was willing to use the machinery of the state to persecute Jewish Germans in ways that caused immense suffering. But his primary motivation in the economic sphere was not ideological, it was acquisitive. He did not confiscate Jewish property because he believed in racial theory. He confiscated it because it was there, because the ideological framework made it politically acceptable, and because no one was in a position to stop him. This distinction matters, not because it makes his actions less criminal, they were monstrous regardless of motivation, but because it illuminates how the Nazi system actually operated. The ideology provided the justification, the economics provided the incentive, and men like Göring, who cared more about the incentive than the justification, were the ones who made the machinery run. The single event that most clearly illustrates this dynamic is Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9th and 10th, 1938. The pogrom, which involved the destruction of thousands of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues and homes across Germany and Austria, was primarily organized by Joseph Goebbels, who saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate ideological fervor and curry favor with Hitler. Göring, by contrast, was furious, not because of the human cost, which did not particularly concern him, but because of the economic waste. All that property, all those businesses, all that inventory, smashed, burned, destroyed by mobs when it could have been confiscated, sold, and the proceeds directed to the state, or, more specifically, to him. At the meeting of senior Nazi officials that followed Kristallnacht, Göring reportedly complained that it would have been far more sensible to simply take the property rather than destroy it. His proposed solution was characteristically practical: impose a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community to pay for the damage that had been inflicted on them. The victims, in other words, would be forced to pay for their own persecution. Even by Nazi standards, this was a breathtaking piece of cynicism. The billion-mark fine was duly imposed, and it was followed by a new wave of regulations that effectively completed the exclusion of Jews from the German economy. Jewish businesses that had survived the previous rounds of Aryanization were now forcibly liquidated or transferred. Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, were barred from practicing. Jewish bank accounts were frozen or subjected to special levies, and Göring, presiding over all of it from his position atop the 4-year plan, ensured that the proceeds were channeled into the rearmament program, and inevitably into his own expanding collection of assets. Meanwhile, the legitimate economic challenges of preparing Germany for war were not being addressed with anything like the same efficiency that was being applied to the business of theft. The 4-year Plan S official goal, making Germany self-sufficient in key strategic materials like rubber, fuel and steel, was failing. Germany simply did not have the natural resources to achieve autarky, and Göring's approach to solving this problem was to throw money at prestige projects rather than to make the difficult strategic choices that genuine self-sufficiency would have required. The most prominent example was the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. Yes, he named it after himself because of course he did. A massive state-owned industrial conglomerate established in 1937 to extract iron ore from low-grade domestic deposits that private industry had deemed uneconomical. The project was enormously expensive, technically dubious, and ultimately unable to produce steel at anything close to competitive costs. But it bore Göring's name, it employed tens of thousands of workers, and it allowed him to present himself as an industrial titan, which was apparently more important than whether the enterprise actually made economic sense. The private industrialists who had supported the Nazi rise to power, the same men Göring had courted in the salons and dinner parties of the early 1930s, now found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. They had backed the regime expecting that it would protect their property, crush the labour unions and provide lucrative military contracts. The first 2 promises had been kept, but the third came with strings attached that were becoming harder to ignore. The 4-year Plan S regulatory apparatus gave the state, meaning Göring, enormous leverage over private business, and the line between government partnership and government extortion was becoming uncomfortably thin. Industrialists who cooperated enthusiastically received contracts, raw material allocations, and access to cheap labour. Those who resisted or complained found their allocations reduced, their permits delayed, and their businesses subjected to inconvenient regulatory scrutiny. It was not quite nationalisation. The Nazis were ideologically opposed to state ownership of the means of production, at least in theory, but it was something that functioned remarkably similarly in practice. The factory owner kept the nameplate on the door, but the man in Berlin decided what the factory produced, how much it charged, and where the profits went. This economic model, state-directed capitalism with systematic corruption as its lubricant, was not unique to Nazi Germany, and it has been replicated in various forms by authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. What made the Nazi version distinctive was the degree to which racial persecution was integrated into the economic structure. The Aryanization program was not a sideshow to the economic policy, it was a core component of it. The confiscation of Jewish wealth provided a one-time infusion of capital that helped paper over the structural deficits in the rearmament program. The exclusion of Jewish professionals created opportunities for non-Jewish Germans who might otherwise have questioned the regime's economic management, and the entire process created a class of beneficiaries, the people who bought the confiscated businesses, who moved into the vacated apartments, who took over the abandoned medical practices, whose material interests were now directly tied to the continuation of the Nazi system. You're far less likely to oppose a government that has just handed you a business at a 90% discount. Göring understood this dynamic intuitively, even if he never articulated it in theoretical terms. He was not an economic thinker. He was a predator who had stumbled into the world's largest prey-rich environment and was gorging himself with the enthusiasm of a man who remembered what it felt like to be hungry. Meanwhile, his personal estate at Hall was expanding at a rate that tracked almost precisely with the expansion of his economic authority. But more on that palace of excess shortly. What matters here is that the renovations were funded by the state because Göring had long since abandoned any distinction between his personal expenses and the public treasury. The economic system Göring built between 1936 and 1939 was, in summary, a machine for converting other people as property into regime power and personal wealth. It was inefficient, corrupt, and ultimately unsustainable. The rearmament program it was supposed to finance was running on borrowed time and borrowed money, and the strategic raw materials problem remained unsolved despite billions of marks in investment. But it accomplished two things that, from the regime's perspective, mattered more than economic efficiency. First, it created a network of complicity that bound the German business class to the Nazi state through shared guilt and shared profit. The industrialists who had benefited from Aryanization, who had received contracts funded by confiscated wealth, who had used forced labour provided by the state. These men could not turn against the regime without implicating themselves. Second, it established the template for something much larger, the systematic economic exploitation of conquered territories that would begin with the annexation of Austria in 1938 and expand to continental scale during the war. Everything Göring had practiced on Germany's Jewish community, the confiscation, the forced sales, the legal veneer over naked theft, would be applied across occupied Europe at a scale that dwarfed anything the pre-war period had seen. The apprenticeship was over, the masterwork was about to begin. While Göring was busy converting the German economy into his personal enrichment scheme, he was simultaneously engaged in another project that consumed almost as much of his energy, the construction of himself. Not metaphorically, though that too, but literally, physically, materially. The man who had once been a lean fighter pilot with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass was, by the mid-1930s, transforming into something that resembled less a military commander and more a particularly well-fed Renaissance prince who had raided the costume department of every opera house in Europe. And the story of that transformation, the clothes, the palaces, the art, the animals, the drugs, the sheer unrelenting spectacle of it all, tells you as much about the nature of the Nazi regime as any policy document or military strategy ever could. Let us start with the wedding, because the wedding was the moment when Göring's personal mythology went from ambitious to genuinely delusional. On April 10th, 1935, Hermann Göring married Emmy Sonnemann, a moderately successful actress from the Hamburg State Theatre, in a ceremony that can only be described as what happens when a man with unlimited state resources and zero sense of proportion decides to plan his own nuptials. The city of Berlin was effectively shut down for the occasion. Streets were closed for 7 hours. 30,000 soldiers and party members marched in formation through the capital in tribute to the happy couple. The guest list read like a who's who of the European diplomatic community. Ambassadors, foreign dignitaries, industrialists and military leaders all gathered to celebrate the union of a man who held approximately 7 different government titles with a woman whose primary qualification for the spotlight was having agreed to marry him. The British ambassador, Sir Eric Phipps, observed afterward that the only thing missing was a royal title, and honestly, given the scale of the event, an actual coronation might have felt like a step down. The choice of Emmy herself was revealing. Karin, Göring's first wife, had been a Swedish baroness, aristocratic, ethereal, and conveniently dead since 1931, which allowed Göring to idealize her memory without the inconvenience of having to live with an actual person. Emmy was different. She was warm, sociable, politically uncomplicated, and perfectly willing to play the role of hostess, trophy, and decorative accessory that Göring required of a wife. She was also, by all accounts, genuinely fond of her husband, which raises questions about human psychology that even the most seasoned historians prefer not to examine too closely. What Emmy provided was not aristocratic credentials. Göring had long since stopped needing those, but the appearance of domestic normalcy. She was the smiling face beside the monster, the gracious hostess who served champagne to foreign diplomats, while her husband was busy dismantling civil liberties and stealing entire industries. Every authoritarian regime needs women like Emmy, people who make the intolerable look civilized, and she performed the role with a skill that deserves recognition, however uncomfortable that recognition might be. The birth of their daughter Edda in June 1938 only intensified Göring's already theatrical approach to family life. He doted on the child with an extravagance that bordered on performance art, showering her with gifts, parading her before visitors, and treating her arrival as though it were an event of national significance, which in the surreal atmosphere of the Nazi court it essentially was. Hitler himself served as Edda's godfather, a detail that sounds almost quaint until you remember what kind of godfather we're talking about. Göring commissioned portraits of his daughter, had rooms in his various residences decorated specifically for her, and reportedly discussed her future with the same grandiosity he brought to discussions of military strategy. The fact that he was simultaneously overseeing economic policies that were destroying the families of millions of other people, his children did not, as far as anyone could tell, strike him as contradictory. Compartmentalization was one of Göring's most refined talents. And then there was Carinhall. We touched on it briefly earlier, but the full scope of this estate deserves its own examination, because Carinhall was not just a house, or even a palace. It was a physical manifestation of everything that was wrong with Göring and, by extension, everything that was wrong with the regime he served. Located in the Schorfheide forest northeast of Berlin, the original building had been a relatively modest hunting lodge that Göring acquired in 1933 and named in memory of Karin. Within 2 years, modesty was a distant memory. The lodge was demolished and replaced with a sprawling complex that eventually encompassed multiple buildings, including a main hall that measured over 100 metres in length, guest wings, servants' quarters, a gymnasium, an indoor pool, a cinema, and, because apparently a 100-metre reception hall was not sufficient for a man of Göring's ego, a separate building dedicated entirely to housing his model railway, which was large enough and elaborate enough that grown adults could operate the trains while sitting in miniature carriages. Let that image settle in for a moment. The second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the commander of the Luftwaffe, the head of the 4-year plan, a man responsible for policies that affected the lives of tens of millions of people, built himself a private building so he could play with model trains. This is not a detail historians invented to make him look ridiculous. This is documented fact. The grounds were equally excessive. Göring maintained a private game reserve stocked with bison, elk, and deer, and he hunted with an enthusiasm and a frequency that suggested he viewed the activity less as a hobby and more as a full-time occupation that occasionally got interrupted by the demands of running a country. He appeared for these hunts in custom-designed outfits that bore approximately the same relationship to actual hunting clothing as a Hollywood costume bears to real medieval armour. Elaborate leather ensembles with decorative elements, archaic styling, and accessories that evoked a fantasy version of the Prussian landed gentry that had never actually existed outside of Göring's imagination. Visiting dignitaries who were invited to hunt at Carinhall, and invitations were issued constantly because Göring viewed his estate as a diplomatic tool, often struggled to maintain appropriate facial expressions when confronted with their hostess appearance. The diplomatic memoirs of the period contain some remarkably restrained descriptions of these encounters, which in the subtle language of international relations means the diplomats were barely containing their astonishment. The interior of Carinhall was where the real excess lived, however, and this is where the story transitions from comedy to something considerably darker. The halls and galleries of the estate were filled with art, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, antiques, and the collection grew at a rate that tracked directly with the expansion of Göring's political and economic power. In the early years, some of the pieces were purchased, though often at prices that bore the unmistakable thumbprint of coercion. When the head of the Luftwaffe expresses interest in buying your painting, the negotiation tends to be somewhat one-sided. As the 1930s progressed and Göring's access to confiscated property expanded, the collection began to include works that had been taken from Jewish collectors, galleries, and dealers under the Aryanization policies he himself administered. By the time the war began and the scope of available plunder expanded to continental proportions, Carinhall had become one of the largest private art collections in Europe, and the word private is doing some extremely heavy lifting in that sentence, since virtually none of it had been acquired through what any reasonable person would describe as a legitimate transaction. Göring's approach to art was not that of a connoisseur. He did not spend hours in quiet contemplation of brushwork or composition. He was a collector in the way that a dragon is a collector. He wanted to possess things, to accumulate them, to fill rooms with them, to be able to walk through galleries and know that everything on the walls belonged to him. He kept meticulous records of his collection and could discuss individual pieces with surprising knowledge, but the knowledge was more akin to that of an auctioneer than an aesthete. He knew what things were worth. He knew what was rare. He knew what would impress visitors. The emotional or spiritual dimension of art, the thing that actually makes it art rather than expensive wallpaper, was largely beside the point. What mattered was that he had it, and someone else did not. Now, let us talk about the uniforms, because the uniforms are where Göring's vanity crossed the line from excessive to clinically fascinating. Over the course of his career in the Nazi regime, Göring designed and commissioned an estimated number of personal uniforms that runs into the dozens. Some historians suggest over 100 variations, though the exact count depends on whether you include minor modifications and seasonal variants, which with Göring was apparently a serious taxonomic question. He had uniforms for every conceivable occasion: formal white tunics for state dinners, pale blue parade uniforms for military reviews, grey-green field uniforms for visits to troops, hunting costumes for Karen Hall, and an assortment of ceremonial outfits decorated with enough gold braid, medals and embroidery to stock a small haberdashery. He changed clothes multiple times a day, appearing at morning meetings in one outfit, at lunch in another, and at evening functions in a third, each more elaborate than the last. Foreign visitors who met him on consecutive days sometimes wondered whether they were dealing with the same person or an entire department. The medals deserve special mention. Göring wore decorations the way other people wore neckties, frequently, prominently, and in quantities that suggested he had never encountered the concept of less is more. His legitimate military decorations from the First World War, including the Blue Max, were supplemented by an ever-growing collection of awards, orders and honours, many of which he had effectively given to himself or arranged to receive through channels that owed more to political pressure than to military merit. The Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, which he awarded himself in 1940 after the fall of France, was worn on a chain at a size that photographs suggest was approximately the diameter of a dessert plate. Other senior military figures wore their decorations with the understated pride of professionals who believed their records spoke for themselves. Göring wore his with the enthusiasm of a child who has just been given a sticker chart and is determined to fill every available space. The contrast between this external flamboyance and Göring's internal reality was stark, and it is here that the comedy gives way to something more pathological. Behind the costumes and the palaces and the hunting parties, Göring was a man in serious physical and psychological decline. His weight, which had been increasing steadily since the late 1920s, reached levels that were medically alarming. Contemporary accounts and photographs from the late 1930s suggest a man weighing somewhere in the range of 130 to 140 kilograms, which for his height was well into the territory of severe obesity. He ate enormously, slept erratically, and exercised only insofar as walking around his vast estate could be considered exercise. His lifestyle was, by any medical standard, a slow-motion health crisis unfolding in real time, and the fact that he was simultaneously responsible for commanding an air force and managing a national economy makes the situation considerably less amusing than it might otherwise be. The drug dependency, which had begun with the morphine addiction after the beer hall putsch, had evolved rather than abated. By the mid-1930s, Göring had transitioned from injectable morphine to paracodeine, a synthetic opioid that he consumed in pill form, reportedly taking handfuls of the tablets throughout the day. His personal physician, a man whose medical ethics appear to have been somewhat flexible, maintained a steady supply and apparently saw no particular urgency in addressing his patient's dependency. The pills affected Göring's behaviour in ways that his subordinates noticed but were powerless to address. He was prone to mood swings, periods of euphoria followed by lethargy, bursts of manic energy followed by extended absences from his duties. Important decisions were delayed or made impulsively depending on which phase of the cycle he happened to be in. Staff officers who needed approvals learned to time their requests for the windows when the chief was in an expansive mood and to avoid him entirely during the dark periods. The German public, meanwhile, was not entirely blind to the absurdity of the figure at the top of their military establishment. In a dictatorship where open criticism could result in a visit from the Gestapo, humour became the only safe form of dissent, and Göring was by far the most popular target. Anti-regime jokes, known as Flüsterwitze or whispered jokes, circulated throughout Germany during the 1930s and 1940s, and a disproportionate number of them featured Göring and his excesses. One popular joke described Göring hanging a torpedo on his chest because he had run out of medal space. Another suggested that he wore a particular uniform to his bath. A third imagined him redecorating the entirety of Berlin as an extension of Karen Hall. These jokes were not just entertainment. They were a form of psychological survival, a way for ordinary Germans to acknowledge the grotesque reality of their leadership without saying so directly. The regime took such humour seriously enough to prosecute people for telling political jokes, which tells you everything you need to know about how secure the leadership felt about its public image. What makes Göring's personal excess historically significant rather than merely entertaining is what it reveals about the nature of the Nazi state itself. Totalitarian regimes are often assumed to be efficient, disciplined, and austere, the image of ranks of identical soldiers marching in lockstep, of a society organized with mechanical precision toward a single goal. The reality of the Third Reich was nothing like this. It was a chaotic, competitive, deeply corrupt system in which rival power centers fought constantly for resources, influence, and access to Hitler, and in which personal enrichment at the expense of the state and the public was not an aberration, but a feature. Göring was the most visible example of this corruption, but he was far from the only one. Goebbels maintained a lavish lifestyle funded by his control of the media. Ribbentrop used his position as foreign minister to acquire property and art. Himmler's SS empire was built on a foundation of slave labor and confiscated wealth. The entire senior leadership of the regime was engaged in a competitive frenzy of acquisition that would have been considered excessive at a Renaissance papal court. Göring's vanity also had direct military consequences, which is something that is easy to overlook when you are distracted by the model railways and the hunting costumes. His obsession with his own image meant that he devoted significant time and energy to activities that had nothing to do with his actual responsibilities: designing uniforms, planning hunting parties, expanding Karen Hall, curating his art collection, at the expense of the work that actually mattered. The Luftwaffe, which was his most important charge, received less and less of his focused attention as the 1930s progressed, and the organizational problems that had been embedded in it from the beginning, the lack of strategic doctrine, the preference for showpiece technology over practical mass production, the promotion of loyal mediocrities over competent professionals, were left to metastasize unchecked. By the time these problems became critical, during the air campaigns of the early 1940s, they were too deeply rooted to fix. There is a psychological term for the kind of behavior Göring exhibited during this period: narcissistic compensation, and it describes the process by which a person with deep insecurities attempts to fill the void through external displays of wealth, power, and status. The child who grew up in someone else's castle, dependent on someone else's generosity, watching his father's humiliation, had become a man who needed to own the biggest castle, wear the most medals, possess the most art, and hold the most titles in order to feel that he was finally somebody. The tragedy, if you can use that word for a man who caused so much suffering, is that no amount of accumulation was ever enough. Each new palace, each new uniform, each new painting on the wall was a temporary fix for a wound that could not be healed by acquisition. Göring was, in this sense, the perfect embodiment of a regime that believed it could solve its problems through conquest and consumption. That if you just took enough from enough people, you could fill whatever emptiness was driving you forward. The regime was wrong, and so was Göring. But neither would understand this until everything they had built was in ruins. His relationship with the rest of the Nazi leadership during this period was a complex web of rivalry, mutual dependency, and barely concealed contempt. Hitler tolerated Göring's excesses because Göring was still useful. His social connections, his administrative energy, and his willingness to take on multiple responsibilities made him a valuable executor of policy, even if his personal behavior was increasingly embarrassing. Goebbels despised Göring for his vulgarity and lack of ideological commitment, but recognized his political importance. Himmler, whose SS empire was steadily expanding into territories that Göring considered his own, including the economic sphere and the intelligence apparatus, maintained a relationship that was outwardly cordial and inwardly predatory. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and gatekeeper, quietly undermined Göring at every opportunity, feeding Hitler's growing doubts about his designated successor's competence and reliability. The Nazi court was, in many respects, not unlike the royal courts of earlier centuries, a place where personal relationships, jealousies, and vendettas drove decision-making as much as policy or strategy. Göring's second marriage and his domestic life at Karen Hall served an important function within this court dynamic. By positioning himself as a family man, the devoted husband, the doting father, the generous host, Göring created an image that was deliberately different from the ascetic, unmarried, vegetarian Hitler and the icily bureaucratic Himmler. He was the human face of the regime, the one who liked good food and good wine and pretty paintings and country weekends. Foreign visitors who were invited to Karen Hall often came away with the impression that Göring was, by Nazi standards, almost reasonable, a man you could talk to, a man who enjoyed the same pleasures as normal people, a man who might, if the circumstances were right, be someone the Western democracies could negotiate with. This impression was carefully cultivated and deeply misleading, but it persisted remarkably well into the late 1930s, when the reality of the regime's intentions should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. By 1939, on the eve of war, Göring occupied a position in the Nazi hierarchy that was simultaneously supreme and precarious. He held more titles and offices than any other figure in the regime. He was the designated successor to Hitler. He commanded the air force, directed the economy, presided over the parliament, governed Prussia, and maintained a personal empire of wealth and influence that spanned the country. But his actual effectiveness as a leader was declining in almost direct proportion to his accumulation of power. He was distracted, overextended, physically deteriorating, and increasingly disconnected from the operational realities of the organizations he nominally commanded. The Luftwaffe needed a full-time commander who understood modern air strategy. The economy needed a manager who could make hard choices about resource allocation. Göring was neither. He was a man in a spectacular uniform sitting in a spectacular palace, surrounded by spectacular art, playing with a spectacular model railway, and slowly, inexorably losing his grip on everything that actually mattered. The stage was set for a catastrophe, and the catastrophe was not going to be long in coming. The war, when it finally came in September 1939, did not arrive as a surprise to Göring. He had, after all, been preparing the economy and the air force for exactly this eventuality for years. What may have surprised him, though he would never have admitted it, was just how dramatically the conflict would expand the scope of his favourite extracurricular activity. Because if the pre-war years had given Göring access to the wealth of Germany's Jewish community and the assets of intimidated industrialists, the conquest of Europe was about to hand him an entire continent's worth of art, gold, jewels, and cultural treasures, all ripe for the taking. The apprenticeship in domestic theft was over. The continental operation was about to begin, and Göring approached it with the enthusiasm of a man who had been window shopping for years and had just been handed an unlimited credit card. The first major expansion of his collecting territory came not with the outbreak of war itself, but a year earlier, with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in March 1938. Austria was not just a strategic acquisition for the regime, it was, from Göring's particular perspective, an extraordinarily lucrative one. Vienna had been home to one of the largest, wealthiest, and most culturally significant Jewish communities in Central Europe, a community of bankers, industrialists, art collectors, and patrons whose accumulated wealth represented centuries of economic activity and cultural investment. The city's Jewish families, the Rothschilds, the Afrusses, the Bloch-Bauers, the Lederers, had built collections that rivaled those of national museums, filling their Ringstrasse palaces with Klimts, Dürers, Old Dutch masters, and Renaissance bronzes that represented not just financial value, but the cultural identity of an entire community. When German troops crossed the Austrian border and the swastika flags went up over the Hofburg Palace, all of that wealth suddenly became available for confiscation under the same Aryanization framework that had already been applied in Germany. Except now, because Austria's Jewish community was proportionally wealthier and more concentrated than Germany's, the pickings were even richer. The speed of the expropriation in Austria was breathtaking, even by the standards of a regime that had already demonstrated considerable talent for organized theft. Within days of the Anschluss, not weeks, not months, days, squads of SS men and local Austrian Nazis were breaking into Jewish homes and businesses, seizing cash, jewellery and valuables with a combination of official authority and freelance brutality that blurred the line between state policy and street robbery. The more systematic confiscation followed within weeks. Jewish businesses were placed under temporary Aryan management, bank accounts were frozen, property registrations were altered, and the entire apparatus of legal dispossession that had taken years to develop in Germany was imported to Austria essentially overnight. Adolf Eichmann, then a relatively junior SS officer, was dispatched to Vienna to oversee Jewish emigration, a euphemism that meant stripping departing Jews of virtually everything they owned as the price of being allowed to leave the country alive. The emigration offices he set up became models of bureaucratic extortion. You could leave Austria, but only after surrendering your property, paying an emigration tax and handing over whatever remaining assets the state had not already claimed. It was in effect a toll booth on the road out of hell, and the toll was everything you had. Göring dispatched his own agents to Vienna with specific shopping lists, particular paintings, particular collections, particular assets that he wanted secured before anyone else could claim them. The competition for stolen goods among the Nazi elite was fierce and petty, with various agencies and individuals racing to grab the most valuable prizes, and Göring's advantage was that his economic authority under the 4-year plan gave him a plausible claim to first pick of virtually anything. When the Rothschild family Viennese art collection was seized, one of the most significant private collections in Europe, assembled over 5 generations and including works by Velázquez, Gainsborough, Holz, and dozens of other masters, Göring personally selected pieces for his own holdings before the remainder was distributed among museums, party officials, and other approved recipients. The Rothschilds naturally received nothing, because the entire point of the exercise was that they were no longer considered people who could own things. The family's attempts to recover it after the war were blocked by the Austrian government, which claimed the painting had been bequeathed to the nation, a claim based on a will that predated the confiscation, and that the family contested as having been misinterpreted. The legal battle continued until 2006, when a United States arbitration panel ruled in favour of the Bloch-Bauer heirs, and the painting was returned to the family, 68 years after it was stolen. It was subsequently sold to the Neue Gallery in New York for $135 million, making it at the time the most expensive painting ever sold. The story became a film, a book, and a symbol of the broader struggle for restitution, all because of a theft that began with Göring's agents arriving in Vienna with their shopping lists in the spring of 1938. The Austrian model, fast, thorough, bureaucratically organised and personally profitable for the men at the top, became the template for everything that followed. When Germany dismembered Czechoslovakia in stages between 1938 and 1939, the same process unfolded. Czech gold reserves held in the Bank of England were transferred to Germany through a series of transactions that the British government, to its eternal embarrassment, facilitated through the Bank for International Settlements, an institution whose wartime role remains one of the more uncomfortable chapters in the history of international finance. Prague's Jewish community was subjected to the same cycle of registration, restriction, confiscation, and expulsion that had already been perfected in Vienna. Then came Poland, and with Poland came a quantum leap in both the scale and the brutality of the plunder. The invasion of September 1939 was not conducted with any pretense of the legal frameworks that had been maintained, however cynically, in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Poland was treated from the first day as conquered territory, to be exploited without restraint or apology. Special units followed the combat troops with orders to locate and secure valuables of every description. Art from museums and churches, gold from banks, industrial equipment from factories, grain from farms, livestock from fields. The cultural losses were staggering. The Wetzstoss altarpiece, a masterpiece of Gothic sculpture in Krakow's St. Mary's Basilica, one of the most important works of art in Poland, carved over 12 years in the 15th century, was dismantled, crated and shipped to Germany. Raffaella's portrait of a young man was taken from the Czartoryski Museum in Krakow and has never been recovered. It remains one of the most significant missing artworks in the world, a ghost in the history of European painting, last reliably documented in 1945 and vanished somewhere in the chaos of the war's final months. University libraries were emptied. Church silver was melted down. The royal castle in Warsaw was systematically stripped of its contents before the building itself was dynamited by retreating German forces in 1944. Private collections were seized without documentation, often by soldiers acting on their own initiative rather than under any coordinated program, which made the Polish plunder simultaneously more chaotic and more total than what had occurred in Austria. Göring's direct involvement in the Polish looting was more supervisory than hands-on. The quality of available art was, by his particular and rather demanding standards, not uniformly first-rate, and he tended to leave the middle-tier acquisitions to subordinates while reserving his personal attention for the exceptional pieces. But his economic directives as head of the 4-year plan shaped the broader framework of exploitation. Poland's agricultural output was requisitioned at levels that left the Polish population, and particularly the Jewish population, confined to ghettos, facing severe food shortages that would worsen dramatically as the war continued. Industrial resources were redirected to the German war economy. Forced labour was extracted on a massive scale, with Polish civilians conscripted to work in German factories and on German farms under conditions that range from harsh to lethal. And then France fell in June 1940, and Göring's eyes lit up like a child's on Christmas morning, if Christmas morning involved the systematic looting of an entire nation's cultural patrimony. Paris was not just a military prize, it was the cultural capital of Europe, home to the Louvre, countless private galleries, and some of the most important art collections in the world, many of them owned by Jewish families who had been prominent in the French art world for generations. The Rothschilds alone, this one family kept appearing in Göring's story like a recurring motif in a very expensive and very tragic opera, maintained multiple collections across their various Parisian properties, including works by Vermeer, Boucher, Chardin, Fragonard, and an inventory of 18th century French decorative arts that was essentially irreplaceable. The David Weil family, the Bernheim Jeune, the Alphonse Cans, the Schloss family with their extraordinary collection of 333 Dutch and Flemish old masters, all of them were sitting in Paris with collections that Göring coveted and that the German occupation now placed within his reach. The organisation that carried out the systematic looting of France was the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR, nominally headed by the Nazi ideologist Alfred Rosenberg but operating in practice under Göring's direct influence. Göring issued a directive in November 1940 that established a clear hierarchy for the distribution of confiscated art. First pick went to Hitler for his planned museum in Linz. Second pick went to Göring personally. Everything else could be distributed among museums, research institutes, and other approved recipients. The number 2 man in the state was literally writing himself into the distribution chain for stolen property, in writing, with his own signature. Not exactly the behaviour of a man concerned about leaving a paper trail, though in fairness, Göring probably assumed the regime would last long enough that nobody would ever hold him accountable for any of it. The ERR established its central collection point at the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris, a gallery in the Tuileries Garden where confiscated artworks were brought, catalogued, photographed and sorted before being distributed. The building became, in effect, the world's most exclusive and most involuntary art gallery, a place where masterpieces that had hung in private homes and galleries across Paris were assembled, displayed and picked over by men in uniform who had no right to any of them. Crates. She recorded what was taken, where it came from, who selected it, and crucially, where it was sent, which trains, which routes, which destinations in Germany. She did all of this at enormous personal risk, hiding her notes and passing information to the French resistance and later to the advancing Allied forces. Her records would prove invaluable in the post-war recovery effort, enabling the Monument's men to locate specific works in specific locations across Germany with a precision that would otherwise have been impossible. Valland received relatively little recognition during her lifetime. She was awarded the Legion of Honor and several other decorations, but her name remained largely unknown to the general public until decades after the war, which is unfortunately a common pattern for women who perform acts of extraordinary courage in wartime. Göring visited the Jeu de Paume personally on at least 20 documented occasions between November 1940 and November 1942. Each visit was an event. He arrived with an entourage, was shown the latest acquisitions by ERR staff, and spent hours walking through the display rooms, selecting works for his collection, with the careful deliberation of a man who took his shopping very seriously indeed. His agent Walter Andreas Hofer accompanied him on these visits, and handled the logistics of transporting selected pieces back to Germany. Hofer maintained detailed records of every acquisition, presented in beautifully prepared catalogues, provenance, dimensions, condition, estimated value, that looked for all the world like the materials a high-end auction house might prepare for a wealthy client. The professionalism of the paperwork stands in grotesque contrast to the criminality of the enterprise. These were not purchases, they were seizures, dressed in the language of commerce the way a mugger might hand you a receipt after taking your wallet. The ERR's own statistics from France tell the story in numbers. Over the course of the occupation, the organisation seized approximately 22,000 objects from Jewish collections. These included paintings, drawings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, porcelain, jewellery, and rare books. The confiscated works filled 138 boxcars. Imagine a train stretching for well over a kilometre, every car packed with the cultural heritage of French Jewish families, that carried the goods eastward to Germany in 29 major shipments between April 1941 and July 1944. The operation continued even as the Allied invasion of Normandy made the regime's hold on France increasingly precarious, which suggests that looting was considered a higher priority than strategic retreat planning, a set of priorities that tells you essentially everything about the regime's value system. The Netherlands suffered similarly. The story of Jacques Goudsticker illustrates the personal dimension of the looting in miniature. The Goudsticker family's legal battle to recover the collection continued for over 60 years, finally achieving partial resolution in 2006. Some threads of Nazi art theft are still being untangled well into the 21st century. In Belgium, the ERR seized collections belonging to Jewish families who had fled ahead of the invasion, as well as works from dealers and galleries that fell under the broad definition of enemy property. In Greece, the occupation authorities confiscated art and antiquities from Jewish collections in Thessaloniki and Athens, adding classical antiquities to the regime's haul. In the occupied Soviet territories, cultural institutions were systematically looted. The Amber Room, an entire chamber of amber panels originally constructed for the King of Prussia in the 18th century, and later installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, was dismantled by German soldiers and shipped to Königsberg, where it was displayed briefly before vanishing entirely in the chaos of the war's final months. It has never been found, and its disappearance remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of wartime art theft. An entire room, made of amber and gold, simply gone. The plunder extended far beyond art. Gold reserves from conquered nations' central banks were seized and transferred to the Reichsbank in Berlin. The Czech gold affair was particularly notorious. Reserves that the Czech government had deposited with the Bank of England were transferred to Germany through the Bank for International Settlements, in transactions that the British authorities facilitated even after Prague had fallen, because apparently the wheels of international finance keep turning regardless of what is happening to the countries whose money is being moved. Belgian gold, Dutch gold, Polish gold, Norwegian gold, all of it flowed to Berlin, financing the war machine that was conquering more territory and seizing more gold in a self-perpetuating cycle of conquest and extraction. Industrial machinery was dismantled and shipped from every occupied country. Agricultural produce was requisitioned at rates that left civilian populations hungry. In Greece, the combination of requisitioning and Allied blockade produced a famine in the winter of 1941 to 1942 that took an estimated 300,000 lives, a catastrophe directly attributable to occupation economic policies that Göring's office helped to shape. There was also a category of acquisition that fell into a murky grey zone between outright seizure and coerced purchase, situations where owners of valuable property in occupied countries were pressured into selling to German buyers at prices that bore no relation to market value, but that technically involved a voluntary transaction. Göring's agents were specialists in this kind of exchange. They would identify a desirable piece, approach the owner with an offer that came wrapped in the unspoken but unmistakable threat of what might happen if the offer were refused, and the owner, understanding perfectly well that refusal meant confiscation with no compensation at all, would sign the papers and accept whatever sum was offered. These forced sales produced a paper trail that looked almost legitimate, which was precisely the point. It was the economics of the protection racket applied to the art market, and it created a category of transactions that would complicate restitution efforts for decades, because the existence of a signed sale document made it possible for post-war possessors to argue that the acquisition had been legal. On July 31, 1941, Göring signed one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century. It was a directive to Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, authorizing him to make all necessary preparations for a complete solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. The document was brief, barely a page, and written in the bloodless bureaucratic language that the regime used to disguise its most monstrous decisions. It did not explicitly describe what a complete solution would look like. It did not need to. Everyone who read it understood what it meant, and the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, where the operational details were coordinated among 15 senior government and SS officials, over a lunch that lasted approximately 90 minutes, roughly the same amount of time it takes to watch a mediocre film, except that the agenda items involved the logistics of murdering 11 million people, flowed directly from the authority that Göring's signature had conferred. The man who had spent years systematically robbing Europe's Jewish communities had now authorized the process that would systematically destroy them. He had taken everything they owned, and now he was signing away everything they were. The connection between the economic plunder and the physical annihilation was not coincidental. It was structural. The same bureaucratic machinery that had catalogued the confiscation of a painting was now being turned to the cataloguing of human beings for deportation. The same railway system that had transported crates of stolen art was now transporting people to their deaths. The same officials who had administered the Aryanization of businesses were now administering the final removal of the people who had built those businesses. It was all one system, and Göring had his fingerprints on every part of it. His collection continued to grow, even as the war turned decisively against Germany. As late as 1943 and early 1944, pieces were still arriving at Karen Hall from occupied territories, transported by rail across a continent increasingly under aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe that Göring commanded could no longer protect German cities from Allied bombers, but somehow the trains carrying his paintings continued to get through, a feat of logistical prioritization that speaks volumes about where his attention was focused. The art was not just a luxury or a hobby, it was the physical manifestation of everything he believed he had become, the proof that he had transformed himself into a figure of consequence, a man of wealth and culture and power. To stop collecting would be to acknowledge that it was all coming apart, and Göring to the very end was constitutionally incapable of making that acknowledgement. The total scale of Nazi art theft across all territories remains difficult to calculate with precision even today. The ERR alone confiscated over 22,000 objects from France. The total across all occupied countries is estimated at somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 individual items, though the true figure may never be known because many confiscations were poorly documented or not documented at all. Much has been recovered. The monuments, fine arts, and archives section of the Allied armies tracked down enormous caches in salt mines, castles, and bunkers across Germany and Austria. The Altersee salt mine in the Austrian Alps alone contained over 6,000 paintings, stashed deep underground alongside crates of gold and crates of documents that the regime had hoped to preserve for a future that never came. The Merkus salt mine in Thuringia yielded the Reichsbank-S gold reserves along with bags of gold dental fillings, a discovery that confronted the American soldiers who found it with a physical, tangible connection between the regime's financial system and its death camps. But a significant portion, estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 individual works, has never been recovered. Some were destroyed in bombing raids, some were taken by Soviet forces as war reparations and remain in Russian collections, their status the subject of ongoing international disputes, and some simply disappeared into the post-war art market, absorbed through dealers who ask no questions into private collections and museum holdings where they remain today, their origins concealed or forgotten. The Görlitz discovery of 2012, over 1,000 works found in a Munich apartment belonging to the elderly son of one of the regime's approved art dealers, demonstrated that hidden caches of looted art are still surfacing, still generating legal battles, still causing pain to the descendants of those who were robbed. Every few years, another painting surfaces at auction, with a gap in its provenance that corresponds suspiciously to the years between 1933 and 1945, and another family begins the long legal process of proving that what hangs on someone else's wall was once stolen from their grandparents' home. The logistics of the looting operation were, in their own grim way, a marvel of organisational capacity, the same organisational capacity that, had it been directed toward legitimate military objectives, might have made a meaningful difference in the war effort. The ERR maintained its own staff of art historians, packers, photographers, and transport specialists. Confiscated works were professionally photographed and catalogued before being crated in purpose-built containers designed to protect fragile canvases during rail transport. Special trains were requisitioned and scheduled, their routes planned to avoid areas of heavy Allied bombing, a courtesy that was extended to the art but not, it should be noted, to the civilian populations of the cities through which the trains passed. Insurance documentation was prepared, customs forms were completed. The entire apparatus of legitimate international art transport was replicated in service of what was, by any legal or moral standard, the largest theft in recorded history. The bureaucratic precision was both impressive and deeply disturbing, a reminder that evil, when it is organised by competent administrators, can be terrifyingly efficient. There was also the question of what happened to art that the regime considered ideologically unacceptable. The Nazis had famously purged German museums of so-called degenerate art in 1937. Works by modernist and avant-garde artists like Picasso, Kandinsky, Klee, Chagall, Nolde, and dozens of others whose styles did not conform to the regime's narrow aesthetic preferences. Some of these works were destroyed, others were sold abroad for foreign currency, which the regime needed badly, and a considerable number simply disappeared into the private holdings of dealers and officials who recognized that ideologically offensive art could still be financially valuable, a distinction that the regime's true believers found difficult to grasp, but that men of more practical inclinations, men like Göring, understood perfectly well. Göring himself, despite officially endorsing the regime's position on degenerate art, was not above using such works as trading chips, exchanging modernist paintings that he personally found unappealing for old masters and traditional works that suited his more conventional taste. He reportedly traded multiple Impressionist and Post-Impressionist works through intermediaries for single pieces by Cranach or other Northern European masters, transactions that amounted to using ideological contraband as currency in a private art market that operated entirely outside any legitimate framework. The human cost behind each confiscated painting is easy to lose sight of when discussing the statistics, and it is worth pausing to remember it. Behind each of those 22,000 objects seized in France was a family. Behind each confiscated Klimt in Vienna was a household that had been shattered. Behind each crate loaded onto a train was someone's grandmother's portrait, someone's wedding gift, someone's connection to a life that had been systematically erased. The art was not just property, it was memory, identity, continuity, the physical expression of lives lived and stories told across generations. When Göring hung a stolen Vermeer on his wall at Karen Hall, he was not just displaying a painting, he was displaying the erasure of the people who had owned it and the system that had made that erasure possible. The painting's beauty and the horror of its provenance existed simultaneously, inseparably, and they still do, in every museum and private collection where works of uncertain wartime origin hang today, beautiful and haunted at the same time. Göring's personal collection, inventoried after his capture, contained approximately 1,500 paintings and hundreds of additional objects: sculptures, tapestries, furniture, jewellery, porcelain. The total value ran into the hundreds of millions in contemporary currency, billions in modern terms. He was, by any reasonable measure, the single largest individual beneficiary of the greatest art theft in human history. And he had accomplished this not through any particular sophistication or connoisseurship. His taste was conventional, his knowledge more commercial than aesthetic, but simply through the application of state power to personal acquisition. He had a bureaucracy, an army, a railway system, and a legal framework that defined his victims as non-persons whose property was forfeit, and he had used all of these tools with a thoroughness that left an entire continent's cultural heritage permanently scarred. The boy from the borrowed castle had built himself the largest private collection in Europe, and the construction materials were other people's lives. Now, with the plunder secured and the darkest authorization bearing his signature, the war in the sky, the arena where his personal reputation was most directly at stake, was about to deliver its devastating judgment on everything he had built and everything he had failed to build. The verdict arrived over the English Channel in the summer of 1940, and it was not the verdict Göring had expected. For years he had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force on the planet, an instrument of total aerial dominance that could sweep any enemy from the sky, flatten any city, and break the will of any nation that dared to resist. In Poland, in Norway, in the Low Countries, in France, the promise had appeared to hold. The Luftwaffe had performed brilliantly in support of the Blitzkrieg campaigns, destroying enemy air forces on the ground, smashing defensive positions, terrorizing civilian populations, and clearing the path for the advancing Wehrmacht with a combination of speed, aggression, and tactical precision that left the world in genuine awe. The fall of France in just 6 weeks seemed to confirm everything Göring had claimed. The Luftwaffe was invincible. Göring was a military genius, and air power alone could bring even great nations to their knees. Then came Britain, and the entire mythology collapsed like a paper airplane in a thunderstorm. The Battle of Britain, which raged from July to October 1940, was the first campaign in which the Luftwaffe faced an opponent that was not already beaten on the ground. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk in a chaotic retreat that rescued the men but left their equipment behind. Britain stood alone, its army weakened, its continental allies gone, its situation, by any conventional military analysis, desperate. Hitler offered peace terms, which Winston Churchill rejected with a defiance that the German leadership found genuinely baffling, because in their experience, nations that found themselves in hopeless military positions tended to negotiate rather than fight. The refusal meant that an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, would be necessary, and an invasion could not succeed unless the Luftwaffe first achieved air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. The task fell to Göring, and he accepted it with the breezy confidence of a man who had never seriously contemplated the possibility that his air force might fail. The confidence was not entirely baseless. On paper, the numbers favoured Germany overwhelmingly. The Luftwaffe could deploy approximately 2,700 aircraft for the campaign, roughly 1,300 bombers, around 300 dive bombers, and over 1,000 fighters, predominantly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the twin-engine Bf-110. Against this, the Royal Air Force S Fighter Command could put up approximately 700 fighters, mainly Hurricanes and Spitfires, spread across a network of airfields in southern and central England. The numerical advantage was roughly 4-1 in total aircraft, and even in fighters alone the Germans held a significant edge. By any simple calculation of force ratios, the outcome should have been a foregone conclusion. Göring certainly believed it was. He told Hitler the RAF could be destroyed in 4 days, and that British air defences could be neutralised in 4 weeks. He was wrong on both counts by a margin that would have been embarrassing if the consequences had not been so lethal. The problem, or rather the cascade of problems, began with assumptions. Göring assumed that numerical superiority would translate automatically into combat superiority, which is a reasonable assumption if you are counting beans in a warehouse, but a dangerous one if you are fighting a war in the sky. What the numbers did not capture was a series of British advantages that would prove decisive. The first and most important was radar. Britain had developed a chain of radar stations along its southern and eastern coasts, the Chain Home system, that could detect incoming German aircraft formations at distances of over 100 miles. This was not a secret exactly. The towers were visible, and German intelligence was aware of their existence. But Göring and his senior commanders consistently underestimated what radar actually meant for the tactical equation. It meant that the RAF did not have to keep its fighters airborne on constant patrol, burning fuel and exhausting pilots while waiting for attacks that might or might not come. Instead, Fighter Command could keep its aircraft on the ground, conserving fuel and pilot energy, and scramble them at short notice when radar showed incoming raids. The Germans had to fly across the Channel, form up, and approach their targets in formations that were visible to British radar operators from the moment they left French airspace. The element of surprise, one of the most valuable assets in aerial combat, was almost entirely absent. The second advantage was organisational. The British had developed an integrated air defence system under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding that was, by the standards of 1940, remarkably sophisticated. Radar data, observer corps reports, and signals intelligence were fed into a central operations room at Bentley Priory, where controllers could track the entire air picture in real time and direct individual fighter squadrons to intercept specific incoming raids. This meant that the RAF could concentrate its limited forces at the right place and the right time, rather than spreading them thin across the entire front. Each fighter sortie was directed by ground controllers who knew approximately where the enemy was, how many aircraft were in the formation, what altitude they were flying at, and which direction they were heading. The German pilots, by contrast, flew into a defensive system they could not see, directed by controllers they could not hear, and intercepted by fighters that appeared, from their perspective, almost magically at the worst possible moment. It was, in modern terms, the difference between playing chess with a full view of the board and playing chess while blindfolded, and the Luftwaffe was wearing the blindfold. The third advantage was the fighters themselves. The Supermarine Spitfire, the aircraft that would become the iconic symbol of the battle, was a genuine match for the Messerschmitt Bf-109 in terms of speed, manoeuvrability and firepower. The two aircraft were so closely matched that encounters between them often came down to pilot skill, tactical position, and luck, rather than any inherent technological advantage. The Hurricane, which actually shot down more German aircraft during the battle than the Spitfire, was slightly less capable in air-to-air combat but was rugged, reliable, easy to repair, and available in larger numbers. Together, the two types gave the RAF a fighter force that was qualitatively competitive with anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air, a fact that Göring, who had been assured by his intelligence staff that British fighters were inferior, found increasingly difficult to accept as the battle progressed. And then there was the problem of range. The Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's best fighter, and the only single-engine aircraft in its inventory capable of meeting the Spitfire on equal terms, had a combat radius that gave it roughly 15 to 20 minutes of fighting time over southern England, before it had to turn back to France or risk running out of fuel and ditching in the Channel. 20 minutes is not a lot of time when you're trying to protect a bomber formation, engage enemy fighters, and accomplish anything strategically meaningful. The Bf 110, which had been designed as a long-range heavy fighter, had the range but not the agility. It was slower, less manoeuvrable, and easier to shoot down than the single-engine British fighters, and it quickly became apparent that the 110s needed escort themselves, which rather defeated the purpose of a fighter escort. This range limitation meant that the Luftwaffe could only project effective fighter cover over a narrow strip of southeastern England. Anything beyond that, the industrial Midlands, the northern cities, the ports and factories that sustained the British war effort, was effectively out of reach unless the bombers went in without fighter protection, which was, as subsequent experience would amply demonstrate, a recipe for catastrophic losses. Göring's response to these challenges was, characteristically, to blame everyone except himself, and to make a series of strategic decisions that range from questionable to disastrous. The initial phase of the campaign focused on attacking Channel shipping convoys and the coastal radar stations, a sound strategy that, if pursued with persistence, might have degraded the British early warning system and improved the odds for subsequent operations. But Göring lacked the patience for attritional warfare. When the radar stations proved difficult to destroy, their steel lattice towers were hard to hit with bombs, and even when damaged they could often be repaired within hours. He lost interest and redirected the attacks toward RAF airfields and aircraft factories, a decision that was strategically sounder, but that he arrived at too late and pursued too inconsistently. The airfield attacks of August and early September 1940 were the most dangerous phase of the battle for the British. Sustained raids on Fighter Command sector stations, the airfields that served as operational hubs for the defence network, caused serious damage and placed the entire system under tremendous strain. Pilots were flying multiple sorties per day, sleeping in their cockpits between missions, and suffering casualty rates that were not sustainable over the long term. Aircraft losses were being replaced by the factories, but experienced pilots were harder to replace than machines, and the attrition was grinding Fighter Command down. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded the Critical 11 Group covering southeastern England, later acknowledged that another 2 weeks of sustained attacks on the sector stations might have broken the defence. The British were, for a brief period, genuinely close to losing the battle, and then Göring made the decision that saved them. On September 7, 1940, he redirected the Luftwaffe's main effort from the airfields to London. The immediate trigger was a series of retaliatory RAF raids on Berlin, small-scale attacks that caused minimal damage but inflicted enormous psychological impact on a Nazi leadership that had promised the German public their capital would never be bombed. Hitler was furious and demanded retaliation against London. Göring, who never needed much encouragement to pursue a dramatic gesture over a sound strategy, enthusiastically agreed. The shift to what became known as the Blitz, the sustained bombing of London and other British cities, was presented as an escalation, a devastating blow that would crush British civilian morale and force the government to sue for peace. In reality, it was a strategic gift to Fighter Command. The shift from airfield attacks to city bombing gave the RAF's battered sector stations time to repair, regroup, and reconstitute their defences. The bombers, now flying deeper into England to reach London, were exposed to fighter interception for longer periods and suffered heavier losses, and British civilian morale, far from cracking under the Blitz, proved remarkably resilient. Londoners endured the bombing with a determination that became one of the defining narratives of the war, and the anticipated collapse in public will simply never materialised. September 15th, 1940, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, saw two massive Luftwaffe raids on London intercepted by massed RAF fighters, with the Germans losing approximately 60 aircraft in a single day. The claims made by both sides at the time were wildly exaggerated. The RAF initially reported shooting down 185 German planes, a figure that was excellent propaganda but roughly 3 times the actual number. But the reality was damaging enough. The Luftwaffe was losing aircraft and crews at rates that could not be sustained, and by mid-September, Hitler quietly shelved Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Britain was off. The Luftwaffe had failed its first major strategic test, and Göring's promises of quick aerial victory lay in ruins alongside the wreckage of his bombers. The total cost of the Battle of Britain tells the story in numbers. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,800 aircraft between July and October 1940. The RAF lost approximately 1,100. In fighter versus fighter combat, the exchange rate was roughly even. The qualitative parity of the aircraft ensured that neither side held a decisive advantage in individual engagements, but the overall loss ratio strongly favoured the British, primarily because bomber losses were heavy and because every German aircrew that went down over England was lost, killed, injured or captured, while British pilots who bailed out or crash-landed could often be recovered and returned to duty. A Spitfire pilot who parachuted into a Kent field was back in the cockpit the next day. A Messerschmitt pilot who parachuted into the same field was a prisoner of war. Over the course of a sustained campaign, this asymmetry was devastating. Göring's reaction to the failure was revealing and deeply characteristic. He did not conduct a sober analysis of what had gone wrong. He did not reorganize his command structure or reassess his strategic assumptions. He did not consult the technical experts who might have identified the systemic weaknesses in his air force. Instead, he blamed his pilots. He publicly accused the fighter pilots of cowardice and lack of aggressive spirit, a charge that was both factually absurd and deeply insulting to men who had been flying multiple combat missions daily against a tenacious and skilled enemy. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's leading fighter aces, and a man who had risked his life repeatedly over the Channel, was summoned to a meeting with Göring and asked what he needed to win the air battle. Galland's reply, that he needed Spitfires, was a piece of dry insubordination that encapsulated the fighter pilot's frustration with a commander who preferred comfortable fantasies to uncomfortable realities. Göring did not find it amusing. The failure over Britain was devastating, but it was only the beginning of the Luftwaffe's decline. Over the next 4 years, the air force that Göring had built and that bore his personal stamp more than any other institution in the Nazi state would be systematically ground down by enemies who outproduced it, outthought it, and eventually overwhelmed it from every direction simultaneously. The story of that decline is not just a military narrative. It is a case study in how personal vanity, organizational dysfunction, and ideological rigidity can destroy a fighting force from within, even when its individual soldiers are brave and its technology is sometimes brilliant. The production problem was fundamental, and it traced directly back to the organizational choices Göring had made in the mid-1930s. The Luftwaffe's approach to aircraft manufacturing was characterized by a proliferation of types, a preference for technical sophistication over mass producibility, and a chronic inability to standardize production processes across the German aviation industry. While Britain's Lord Beaverbrook, appointed Minister of Aircraft Production in May 1940, ruthlessly simplified British aircraft manufacturing, focusing on a handful of proven designs and demanding maximum output through standardized production methods, Germany's aviation industry remained a fragmented landscape of competing manufacturers, experimental programs, and prestige projects that consumed resources without delivering aircraft in the numbers the front demanded. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, which was the Luftwaffe's best fighter throughout the war, was continuously modified and upgraded in ways that improved its performance, but also complicated its production. Each new variant required retooling, retraining, and a period of reduced output that the Air Force could not afford. The comparison with Allied production is stark and ultimately damning. By 1943, Britain was producing approximately 26,000 aircraft per year. The United States, whose industrial capacity dwarfed every other nation on Earth, produced over 85,000 military aircraft in 1943 alone, a number so large that it is worth pausing to let it sink in. 85,000 aircraft in a single year. That is roughly 230 per day, every day, for 12 months. Germany, despite the urgency of its situation and the undeniable skill of its engineers, produced approximately 25,000 aircraft in the same year, a respectable number in isolation but utterly inadequate when set against the combined output of its enemies, and the gap was widening. By 1944, American production alone exceeded 100,000 aircraft, while Germany's output, despite a frantic reorganization of the aviation industry under Albert Speer's direction, reached only about 40,000. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable. The Allies could replace their losses and still grow stronger, while the Luftwaffe was fighting a war of diminishing returns in which every aircraft lost was incrementally harder to replace. Göring's contribution to this production disaster was both direct and indirect. Directly, his management of the aviation industry through the Air Ministry was marked by the same combination of interference, inconsistency, and preference for loyal subordinates over competent ones that had characterized his leadership from the beginning. He championed pet projects. The Heinkel He-177, a heavy bomber that was plagued by engine fires and never achieved operational reliability, consumed years of development time and vast resources for minimal return. He demanded that the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a genuinely revolutionary aircraft that could have given the Luftwaffe a significant technological advantage, be configured as a bomber rather than a fighter, a decision so baffling from a military standpoint that it became one of the most debated controversies of the air war. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied aircraft in service, and could have been devastating as an interceptor against the bomber formations that were destroying German cities. Using it as a bomber negated its primary advantage and delayed its operational deployment by months. When the jet finally entered service in significant numbers in late 1944, it was too late and too few to change the outcome. The window of opportunity that the technology had offered was closed, and Göring's insistence on the bomber configuration was a significant factor in closing it. Indirectly, Göring's declining engagement with his duties was perhaps even more damaging. As the air war turned against Germany and the news from every front grew worse, Göring retreated, physically and psychologically, from the responsibilities of command. He spent increasing amounts of time at Carinhall, surrounded by his art collection and his model railways, while the Luftwaffe's operational headquarters dealt with crises that demanded decisive leadership and received instead silence, absence, or belated and contradictory instructions. His drug dependency, which had been manageable in the relatively relaxed pre-war years, was now actively impairing his judgment and his ability to function. Staff officers who needed urgent decisions learned to route them through subordinates, or to make the decisions themselves and present Göring with a fait accompli, because waiting for the commander-in-chief to engage with the problem was a luxury the situation no longer afforded. The Eastern Front compounded the catastrophe. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Luftwaffe was committed to supporting the largest land campaign in history, across a front that eventually stretched from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The initial performance was spectacular. In the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground, and established air superiority across the entire front. But the campaign that was supposed to last 6 weeks dragged on into months and then years, and the sustained demands of the Eastern Front bled the Luftwaffe of aircraft and crews at rates that the production system could not replace. The Soviet Air Force, which had been nearly annihilated in the opening days, was rebuilt with astonishing speed, fueled by relocated factories beyond the Urals and by Lend-Lease supplies from the United States and Britain, and by 1943 it was contesting air superiority on the Eastern Front with growing effectiveness. The Stalingrad disaster of the winter of 1942 to 1943 delivered one of the most damaging blows to the Luftwaffe's reputation and capability. When the German Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad in November 1942, Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, a commitment that required delivering approximately 700 tons of supplies per day to the pocket. This was, by any rational assessment, impossible. The available transport aircraft were insufficient. The weather conditions over the Russian steppe in winter were appalling. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft defences around the pocket were formidable and growing stronger, and the airfields within the encirclement were under constant artillery fire and shrinking as the pocket contracted. The actual daily delivery averaged around 90 tons, roughly 1/8 of what was needed. The Sixth Army starved, froze, and eventually surrendered. Approximately 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, of whom fewer than 6,000 would eventually return home. And the Luftwaffe lost approximately 500 transport aircraft in the futile supply effort, planes and crews that were desperately needed elsewhere and that could not be replaced. Göring's promise to supply Stalingrad by air was perhaps the single most consequential lie of his career, and it was a lie that he must have known was a lie at the moment he made it. His own logistics officers had told him the numbers did not work. The transport fleet did not have the capacity. The conditions made reliable delivery impossible. But Göring told Hitler what Hitler wanted to hear, that the army could hold, that the air bridge would sustain it, that the situation was manageable. Because telling Hitler the truth would have meant confronting a reality that neither man was willing to face. The result was a catastrophe that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and that accelerated the Luftwaffe's decline from a first-rate fighting force to a hollow shell. By 1944, the air war over Germany itself had become a one-sided affair that bore no resemblance to the confident promises Göring had made in the years before the war. The Allied combined bomber offensive, the British bombing by night, the Americans by day, was systematically demolishing German industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure and urban areas. The 8th Air Force's introduction of long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, which could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, eliminated the Luftwaffe's last tactical advantage, which had been the inability of earlier escort fighters to protect the bomber formations throughout their missions. Now, wherever the bombers went, the Mustangs went too, and the Luftwaffe's interceptor force was caught between the twin imperatives of attacking the bombers and defending itself against the escorts. Losses mounted catastrophically. In what the Luftwaffe called Big Week, a sustained Allied offensive in February 1944, the German fighter force lost approximately a third of its single-engine fighters and nearly a fifth of its fighter pilots in just 6 days. These were experienced pilots who had been fighting for years, and their loss was irreplaceable in a way that aircraft losses were not. The pilot training crisis was, in many respects, even more devastating than the production shortfall. Early in the war, Luftwaffe pilots had been superbly trained, products of a rigorous program that turned out skilled, confident aviators with hundreds of hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. But as losses mounted and the demand for replacement pilots grew, training programs were shortened, fuel allocations for training flights were cut, and new pilots were sent to frontline units with progressively less preparation. By 1944, the average new Luftwaffe pilot arrived at his squadron with roughly 100 hours of total flight time, compared to over 300 hours for the average new American or British pilot. In aerial combat, experience is the single most important determinant of survival. A pilot's chances of being shot down decrease dramatically after his first few missions, as he learns the tactical instincts that keep him alive, and sending inadequately trained pilots into combat against experienced Allied aviators was essentially feeding them into a machine designed to destroy them. The casualty rates among new pilots were staggering, and each loss further depleted the pool of experience that the Luftwaffe needed to remain effective. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, the Luftwaffe's impotence was displayed for the entire world to see. The largest amphibious invasion in history was supported by approximately 11,000 Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe managed to put roughly 100 sorties over the beaches on the first day, 100 against 11,000. The disparity was so extreme that it barely qualifies as a contest. Allied soldiers on the beaches reported seeing virtually no German aircraft during the critical first hours of the landing, a fact that would have seemed inconceivable just 4 years earlier when the Luftwaffe had been the terror of Europe. Göring, confronted with reports of the invasion, reportedly retreated to his quarters and refused to take calls. The man who had promised that no enemy bomb would fall on German soil, the man who had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could defeat any enemy in the air, the man who had staked his reputation and his career on the power of his air force, that man had nothing left to offer except silence. The final year of the air war was an extended exercise in futility. The Luftwaffe's remaining experienced pilots fought with courage and occasional brilliance. Men like Erich Hartmann, who would end the war with 352 confirmed victories, the highest score of any fighter ace in history, continued to fly and fight long after the strategic situation was hopeless. The Mi-262 jet, when it finally appeared in fighter configuration in the autumn of 1944, was genuinely terrifying to Allied pilots who encountered it. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for an interceptor that could outrun any propeller-driven aircraft in the sky. But there were never enough jets, never enough trained pilots to fly them, never enough fuel to keep them operational, and never enough airfields that were safe from Allied strafing attacks. The Me-262 was a glimpse of the future that arrived too late to change the present, and its story, brilliant technology undermined by production failures, command interference, and strategic incoherence, was in many ways the story of the Luftwaffe itself. Göring's personal decline during these final years mirrored the decline of the force he commanded. He grew heavier, more lethargic, more dependent on his pills, and more disconnected from operational reality. His meetings with Hitler became increasingly tense and humiliating, as the Führer, who needed someone to blame for the destruction being rained on German cities, directed his fury at the man who had promised him aerial supremacy and delivered aerial catastrophe. Göring was stripped of responsibilities one by one, his authority transferred to more energetic subordinates, while he retained the titles and the uniforms but lost the substance of power. He spent more and more time at Hall, retreating into a fantasy world of art, hunting, and self-medication, while the country burned around him. The other members of the Nazi inner circle, who had once deferred to him as the number 2 in the hierarchy, now treated him with barely concealed contempt. Goebbels mocked him in his diary. Speer bypassed him in armaments decisions. Bormann systematically poisoned Hitler's opinion of his designated successor. Himmler's SS expanded into domains that had once been Göring's exclusive territory. The man who had once been the most powerful figure in the regime, after Hitler himself was becoming an irrelevance, a grotesque, overfed relic of a phase of the war that had ended years ago, still wearing his spectacular uniforms and his oversized medals, while the world he had helped create collapsed around him. The Luftwaffe's failure was not ultimately the failure of any single decision or any single commander, though Göring's personal shortcomings certainly accelerated and deepened the disaster. It was a systemic failure, the product of an approach to warfare that prioritized spectacle over substance, loyalty over competence, and short-term aggression over long-term planning. The air force that Göring built was designed to win short, sharp campaigns through overwhelming tactical force, and for the first 2 years of the war, that was exactly what it did. But it was never designed to fight a sustained, multi-front war of attrition against enemies with greater industrial capacity, deeper manpower reserves, and the strategic patience to absorb early defeats and build toward eventual victory. When the war became exactly that kind of conflict, as it inevitably did once the Soviet Union and the United States entered the fight, the Luftwaffe was fighting with a tool that was not designed for the job, commanded by a man who was not capable of adapting to a challenge that exceeded his capacity for fantasy. The sky that had once made Göring a hero had now rendered its final judgment on everything he had promised and everything he had failed to deliver, and the judgment was written in the contrails of 10,000 Allied bombers streaming unmolested over the ruins of the Reich. By the spring of 1945, the contrails over the ruins had become a permanent feature of the German sky, and there was nothing Hermann Göring or anyone else could do about them. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was in its 12th and final one, and the speed of its disintegration was accelerating with every passing week. In the east, the Red Army had crossed the Oder River and was less than 50 miles from Berlin, advancing through a landscape of shattered towns and refugee columns that stretched to the horizon. In the west, American, British and French forces had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into the German heartland, encountering resistance that varied from fanatical to non-existent, depending on which unit they faced, and whether its commander had concluded that dying for a lost cause was a reasonable career move. In the south, Italy had long since switched sides. In the north, Denmark and Norway were cut off. The Luftwaffe, Göring's Luftwaffe, the force that was supposed to shield the fatherland from its enemies, was reduced to scrounging for fuel, flying missions with student pilots who had barely mastered takeoffs and landings, and occasionally sending up the handful of remaining Me-262 jets that could still find an intact runway. The war was over in every sense except the formal one, and the only question remaining was how the men who had started it would handle the end. For Göring, the final months of the war were a strange and increasingly surreal experience, a prolonged negotiation between the reality of total defeat and the fantasy of personal relevance that he was not yet ready to abandon. He had been marginalized within the regime for over a year. Hitler barely spoke to him. The other members of the inner circle treated him as an embarrassment at best and a liability at worst. His military authority was nominal. Real decisions about the air war were being made by subordinates who had long since learned to work around their absent commander rather than through him. His economic empire had been dismantled piece by piece as Albert Speer took over armaments production, and various other officials absorbed the functions that Göring had once monopolized. Even his beloved Karen Hall was under threat, with the Red Army S advance bringing the front line close enough that the estate's own staff could hear artillery fire in the distance. The evacuation of Karen Hall in January and February 1945 was a microcosm of everything that was wrong with Göring's priorities, and, by extension, the regime S. While Germany's civilian population was fleeing westward in one of the largest forced migrations in European history, millions of people on foot, in wagons, on trains, carrying whatever they could and leaving behind everything else, Göring was organizing a military-grade logistics operation to save his art collection. Trucks, trains, and personnel that could have been used for military purposes or civilian evacuation were instead devoted to crating, loading, and transporting approximately 1,500 paintings, along with sculptures, tapestries, furniture, and other treasures, from Karen Hall to various hiding places in southern Germany and Austria. The operation was conducted with the kind of meticulous planning that the Luftwaffe S actual military operations had long since ceased to receive. Paintings were individually wrapped, crates were custom built, transport routes were planned to avoid the worst of the Allied bombing. And when the last truckload of art had departed, Göring ordered the demolition of Karen Hall itself. Sappers from the Luftwaffe S engineering division blew up the buildings to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. The palace that had been his personal monument, the physical embodiment of everything he had stolen and everything he had aspired to be, was reduced to rubble by its own creator rather than surrendered to the enemy. There is a metaphor in there somewhere, though Göring was probably not in the mood to appreciate it. The destruction of Karen Hall was, in a sense, Göring's farewell to the version of himself that had existed since 1933. The great collector, the patron of the arts, the Renaissance man in a Reichsmarschall S uniform. What remained was the politician, and the politician had one last card to play. Despite his marginalization, despite the contempt of his colleagues, despite his physical deterioration and his drug dependency, Göring still held one formal distinction that no one had yet taken from him. He was, officially, Hitler's designated successor. This designation dated back to a decree of June 29, 1941, in which Hitler had named Göring as his successor in the event of his death or incapacity. A designation that had been reaffirmed in Hitler's political testament and that had never been formally revoked, despite the many reasons that might have justified doing so. As long as that designation stood, Göring had a claim, thin, contested but technically legitimate, to assume leadership of the Reich if Hitler were unable to continue. By late April 1945, the question of Hitler's ability to continue was no longer theoretical. The Führer had retreated to the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a subterranean complex that combined the cheerfulness of a submarine with the interior design sensibilities of a parking garage. From this concrete tomb, Hitler continued to issue orders to armies that no longer existed, move divisions on maps that bore no relation to reality, and alternate between manic fantasies of miraculous victory and nihilistic pronouncements about the German people deserving their fate for having failed him. The generals who attended his daily briefings, those who had not already fled, surrendered, or been shot for defeatism, described a man who was physically broken, mentally unstable, and increasingly disconnected from any recognizable version of reality. His hands trembled, his gait was shuffling, his rages, always a feature of his personality, had become more frequent and more extreme, sometimes lasting for hours and leaving his staff visibly shaken. Whether this deterioration was caused by Parkinson's disease, the cocktail of medications administered by his personal physician Theodor Morell, the accumulated stress of 5 years of war, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. The leader of the Reich was, by any functional definition, incapacitated. Göring, who had relocated to his estate at Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler's own retreat complex on the Berghof was nearby, though Hitler himself had not left Berlin, watched these developments with a mixture of calculation and alarm. He was receiving reports from multiple sources about the situation in the bunker, and what the reports described was a man who was either already finished or very close to it. The question was what to do about it, and the answer depended entirely on which version of the future you believed in. If you believed that Germany still had a chance, not of winning the war, which was obviously impossible, but of negotiating a survivable peace, then someone needed to take charge, and quickly, before the opportunity for negotiation vanished entirely. If you believed that the Western Allies might be willing to consider a separate peace that excluded the Soviet Union, a belief that was delusional but widely held among the German elite, who convinced themselves that the Western democracies would eventually realize that Stalin was a bigger threat than Hitler and pivot accordingly, then the person conducting that negotiation needed to be someone the Allies could deal with. And who better than the charming English-speaking aristocratic Göring, the man who had always been the regime's presentable face, the diplomat in the fancy uniform, the one who hosted foreign ambassadors at his hunting lodge, and made them feel that the Nazis were not so bad once you got to know them. This was the calculus behind Göring's last gamble, and it reveals both his political instincts and his extraordinary capacity for self-delusion. He was right that someone needed to act. He was right that Hitler was effectively incapacitated. He was even right, in a narrow technical sense, that the succession decree gave him a legitimate basis for assuming authority. What he was spectacularly wrong about was everything else. The Allied willingness to negotiate, his own credibility as a negotiating partner, and his ability to execute a political maneuver within a regime that, even in its death throes, was lethally dangerous to anyone who appeared to be reaching for power without permission. On April 23, 1945, Göring sent a telegram to Hitler in the bunker. The telegram was carefully worded. Göring had drafted it with the help of his staff, and several versions were produced before the final text was agreed upon. It referenced the 1941 succession decree, and stated that if Hitler did not respond by a specified time, Göring would assume that the Führer was unable to exercise his functions, and would take over leadership of the Reich, in accordance with the established line of succession. The tone was deferential. Göring addressed Hitler with the usual formalities, and expressed his continued loyalty. But the substance was unmistakable. He was telling Hitler, "If you cannot lead, I will. If you do not respond, I will take your silence as consent." The telegram arrived in the bunker and was immediately seized upon by Göring's enemies, principally Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and the most powerful man in the bunker after the Führer himself. Bormann had despised Göring for years, professionally, personally, and with the particular intensity of a bureaucratic gatekeeper who viewed any challenge to his control of access as an existential threat. He presented the telegram to Hitler not as a legitimate succession inquiry, but as an act of treason, an attempted coup by a disloyal subordinate who was trying to usurp power while his leader was still alive and fighting. Bormann may have embellished his interpretation. He may have added context that cast the telegram in the worst possible light. He certainly exploited Hitler's paranoia, which by this point was operating at levels that made clinical paranoiacs look well adjusted. The result was exactly what Bormann wanted. Hitler flew into a rage. The response from the bunker was immediate and brutal. Hitler ordered Göring stripped of all his offices, expelled from the Nazi Party and placed under arrest. An SS detachment at Obersalzberg was instructed to take Göring into custody and, if Berlin fell, to execute him. In a single afternoon, the man who had been the second most powerful person in the Reich, the designated successor, the holder of more titles and offices than any other figure in the regime, was transformed into a prisoner of the state he had helped to build. The succession decree was revoked. Göring's name was struck from the party rolls. His military rank, his civilian offices, his honorary titles, all of it gone, erased by a few sentences transmitted from a concrete bunker to a mountain retreat, while Soviet artillery shook the ground above both locations. The SS men who arrived to arrest Göring found a man who was, by all accounts, genuinely bewildered by the ferocity of the response. He had expected pushback, perhaps negotiation, possibly a terse refusal. He had not expected to be treated as a traitor. The distinction between what he had done, invoking a legitimate succession mechanism in a moment of obvious crisis, and how it was interpreted, as a grab for power by a disloyal opportunist, was the final illustration of how the Nazi court functioned. In a system where power derived entirely from the personal favour of one man, any attempt to exercise authority independently, no matter how legally grounded, could be reframed as betrayal. Göring had spent 20 years navigating this system, and in the end he was destroyed by it in the span of an afternoon. What happened next was chaos, because by late April 1945, chaos was the only thing the Reich could still produce efficiently. Göring was held under SS guard at Obersalzberg, but the guards themselves were in an impossible position. They had orders to execute their prisoner if Berlin fell, but Berlin's fall was a matter of days. Communications were breaking down, the chain of command was dissolving, and nobody was entirely sure who was in charge of anything anymore. On April 25th, Allied bombers attacked the Obersalzberg complex, destroying much of the Berghof and damaging the surrounding buildings. In the confusion that followed, Göring's SS guards found themselves more concerned with their own survival than with executing their prisoner. The bombing raid, ironically, may have saved Göring's life. The destruction disrupted the security arrangements and made it easier for him to negotiate his own terms with the increasingly demoralized guards. Hitler committed suicide in the bunker on April 30th. In his political testament, the final document he dictated before his death, he expelled Göring from the party for the second time, just in case the first expulsion had not been sufficiently clear, and named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor instead. Donitz, a naval officer with no particular political ambitions and no power base outside the rapidly shrinking area still under German control, inherited what was left of the Reich, which at that point was roughly the territory between the advancing Allied and Soviet armies, plus a few isolated pockets of resistance that had not yet received the news. Göring was not mentioned in the succession except as an example of treachery, which was not exactly the legacy he had spent 2 decades cultivating. With Hitler dead and the regime in its final hours, Göring's thoughts turned, as they always did in moments of crisis, to his own preservation, and equally important to the preservation of his possessions, the art collection, the jewels, the personal effects, the accumulated loot of a 12-year career of systematic theft. All of it needed to be moved, hidden, or transported to wherever Göring intended to end up. His plan, such as it was, involved heading south toward the Austrian Alps, where he apparently believed he could surrender to the Americans on favourable terms. The reasoning was characteristic. Göring assumed that the Americans would recognise him as a significant figure, treat him with the respect due to a former head of state, and perhaps even see him as a useful interlocutor in the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. He was, in other words, still operating under the delusion that his charm, his title, and his connections made him valuable rather than simply criminal. The capacity for self-deception that had sustained him through the Stalingrad airlift debacle and the destruction of the Luftwaffe was still functioning at peak capacity, even as everything around him burned. The convoy that Göring assembled for his journey south was a spectacle that deserves to be preserved in the historical record purely for the sheer audacity of its absurdity. It consisted of approximately 20 vehicles, cars, trucks, and support vehicles, carrying Göring, his wife Emmy, his daughter Edda, and an entourage of approximately 75 people that included adjutants, personal staff, a private chef, a valet, a nurse, bodyguards, and various other personnel whose exact functions in the final days of a collapsing military dictatorship are difficult to determine, but presumably involved ensuring that the Reichsmarshal's creature comforts were maintained even during the apocalypse. Additional trucks carried luggage, personal effects, and whatever portion of the art collection and personal treasures could be loaded in the time available. Separate trains had already been dispatched southward with the bulk of the collection, though the deteriorating rail network meant that not all of them arrived at their intended destinations. The art trains themselves became one of the more bizarre subplots of the war's final act. At least 2 major rail shipments of Göring's collection headed south through Bavaria toward the Austrian border, carrying crates of paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects that were worth more than the annual economic output of a small country. One train, containing what Göring's staff considered the most valuable pieces, was directed toward Berchtesgaden, while another was routed toward the Weldenstein area, near the castle where Göring had grown up. The logistics of moving fine art by rail through a country that was being simultaneously bombed from the air and invaded on the ground were, to put it mildly, challenging. Bridges were out, tracks were damaged, rail yards were bombed. At various points, the art trains were shunted onto sidings to make way for military traffic, left standing in open countryside where they were vulnerable to strafing attacks, or simply abandoned when the locomotives ran out of coal. Some crates were offloaded at intermediate points and hidden in local mines, farmhouses, and even church basements by Göring's staff, who were improvising storage solutions on the fly with the desperate creativity of people who knew that failure meant facing their employer's legendary temper, even if their employer was at that moment a wanted fugitive whose authority extended approximately as far as the range of his own voice. Meanwhile, the mythical Alpine Redoubt, the supposed mountain fortress in southern Bavaria and Austria, where the Nazi leadership was going to make its last stand, was proving to be exactly that, a myth. Allied intelligence had spent months worrying about the possibility that the regime would retreat to a prepared defensive position in the Alps and hold out indefinitely, forcing a prolonged and costly final campaign through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. This concern had influenced Allied strategy and contributed to the decision to advance towards southern Germany rather than racing for Berlin, which was left to the Soviets. In reality, the Alpine Redoubt existed mainly in the imaginations of propaganda writers and intelligence analysts who had overestimated the regime's capacity for organized resistance. There were no prepared mountain fortresses. There were no stockpiled weapons and supplies. There was no last-ditch defense plan. There was, instead, a collection of confused and demoralized Nazi officials, fleeing military units and displaced civilians, all converging on the same narrow alpine valleys, with no coordination and no clear idea of what they were supposed to do when they got there. Göring was one of them, and his arrival, with his 20-vehicle convoy, his 75-person entourage, and his truckloads of stolen art, was among the more conspicuous entries in what was essentially the world's most dismal traffic jam. The fate of the other senior Nazis during these final weeks provides useful context for Göring's own situation. Himmler, whose SS empire had made him the most feared man in Europe, was engaged in his own delusional peace negotiations. He had been secretly contacting the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte, offering to surrender German forces on the Western Front while continuing to fight the Soviets, apparently under the impression that the Allies would find this proposal reasonable rather than insulting. When Hitler learned of Himmler's contacts, the result was the same as with Göring, an order for arrest and execution that could not be effectively carried out in the chaos of the collapse. Himmler would eventually be captured by the British, disguised in civilian clothes and carrying false papers, and would bite down on a cyanide capsule during his initial interrogation. Goebbels, the propaganda minister, took a different path. He remained in the bunker with Hitler, and after the Führer's suicide he poisoned his 6 children and then had himself and his wife shot by an SS orderly. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, fled and went into hiding, eventually being captured by British forces in a Hamburg boarding house. Speer, the armaments minister, surrendered to the Allies and immediately began constructing the narrative of the good Nazi who had secretly resisted Hitler's scorched earth orders, a narrative that would prove remarkably effective at his trial and remarkably misleading in its omissions. Each of these men dealt with the end in a manner that revealed something essential about their character. Göring's manner, the convoy, the chef, the assumption that surrender was the beginning of a negotiation rather than the end of a career, was perfectly in character for a man who had spent his entire life believing that charm, status, and the right connections could get him out of any situation. The convoy moved through a Germany that was barely recognizable as a functioning country. Roads were clogged with refugees, deserters, and retreating military units. Bridges were destroyed or contested. Allied fighter bombers patrolled the skies, strafing anything that moved on the roads below. The infrastructure that had sustained the most powerful military machine in Europe had disintegrated, and the journey that would have taken hours in peacetime took days in the chaos of the final collapse. Göring's motorcade, 20 vehicles, 75 people, a personal chef, wound its way through this landscape of devastation with the surreal quality of a luxury cruise ship navigating through a hurricane. The contrast between the convoy's contents and its context, between the man with the private chef and the civilians dying in ditches beside the road, was so extreme that it barely requires commentary. It was the entire story of Göring's career compressed into a single image. On May 6, 1945, 2 days before the official German surrender, Göring made contact with American forces. Specifically, he surrendered to elements of the 36th Infantry Division of the United States Army near the town of Rastatt in Austria. The encounter was, by several accounts, one of the more memorable moments of the war's closing days, though memorable is perhaps an understatement. The American soldiers who received Göring's surrender found themselves confronted with a figure who seemed to have arrived from a different century, an enormously fat man in an elaborate uniform, accompanied by a retinue that included personal servants, enormous quantities of luggage, and a collection of monogrammed accessories that suggested he had been expecting a reception rather than a surrender. Göring was genial, cooperative, and, to the amazement of his captors, apparently under the impression that he would be treated as a distinguished prisoner of war, perhaps even as a visiting dignitary. He shook hands, posed for photographs, smiled for the cameras, and generally conducted himself as though he were arriving at a diplomatic conference rather than the beginning of what would turn out to be the last year of his life. The Americans, to their credit, were initially polite but increasingly incredulous. Göring talked freely, expansively, and with a confidence that was hard to reconcile with the fact that he was a prisoner accused of crimes that were only beginning to be fully understood. He expressed admiration for American military equipment. He offered opinions on the strategic conduct of the war. He suggested, with apparent sincerity, that he and the American commanders might find common ground in the face of the Soviet threat. The same fantasy of a Western Soviet split that had sustained him through the final weeks in the mountains. He seemed genuinely surprised when, instead of being housed in comfortable quarters and invited to strategy sessions, he was processed as a prisoner, searched, and informed that he would be transferred to an interrogation facility. The gap between Göring's expectations and his reality was, at this point, so wide that light could not cross it. His personal effects were inventoried, and the inventory reads like the packing list of a man who had planned for a very different kind of trip. He had brought with him several changes of uniform, personal jewellery including a diamond-studded baton that he had designed for himself, a collection of medals and decorations, toiletries, medications, including, crucially, a supply of paracodeine pills, personal stationery, and a variety of luxury items that the average German refugee, trudging westward with everything they owned in a handcart, might have found somewhat excessive. Somewhere among these effects, concealed in a manner that would not be fully understood until much later, was a small brass cartridge containing a glass capsule filled with potassium cyanide. Whether Göring had the capsule with him from the moment of his surrender or acquired it later during his imprisonment is a question that has never been definitively answered. What is known is that when the moment came, he had it, and he used it. The initial period of American custody was, from Göring's perspective, not entirely unpleasant, or at least not as unpleasant as he had feared. He was held at a series of facilities, interrogated extensively by Allied intelligence officers, and treated with a degree of formality that reflected his former rank, even as it became increasingly clear that he was not a prisoner of war but a suspected war criminal. The interrogators found him cooperative, articulate, and almost compulsively talkative. He seemed to enjoy the attention and the opportunity to present his version of events, which bore approximately the same relationship to the historical record as a press release bears to an audit. He downplayed his involvement in the worst crimes of the regime, emphasized his cultural interests and his supposed moderation, and positioned himself as a rational actor who had been swept up in events beyond his control. It was, in essence, the same sales pitch he had been making since the 1920s. I am the civilized one, the reasonable one, the man you can do business with, adapted for a new audience and a new set of circumstances. The pitch was considerably less convincing now that the audience had access to captured documents, survivor testimony, and the physical evidence of what the regime had actually done. The first weeks of captivity produced a physical transformation that was, in its own way, as dramatic as anything that had happened in the final months of the war. Göring was separated from his paracodeine supply, the pills that he had been consuming in industrial quantities for years, and forced into what amounted to involuntary detoxification. The withdrawal was painful and disorienting, but the results were striking. Without the drugs dulling his mind and inflating his appetites, Göring began to lose weight rapidly. His features sharpened, his eyes cleared. His mental acuity returned with a speed that surprised his captors, who had been dealing with a bloated, medicated, seemingly half-conscious figure, and now found themselves confronting something rather different, a sharp, alert, and dangerously intelligent man who was already calculating how to defend himself at the trial everyone knew was coming. The American psychiatrist who examined him at the Mondorf internment facility, the so-called ash can, where senior Nazi prisoners were collected before being transferred to Nuremberg, noted that Göring SIQ tested at 138, placing him well above average and making him, in purely cognitive terms, one of the more formidable figures the prosecution would face. The fat, drugged caricature was melting away, and what was emerging underneath was the man who had once talked German industrialists into funding a fascist revolution. Older, thinner, and facing considerably worse consequences, but still recognisably the same political animal. The other prisoners at the Mondorf facility regarded Göring with a mixture of deference, resentment, and unease. He was the highest-ranking defendant, the former second-in-command of the entire regime, and he carried himself accordingly, not with the broken submissiveness of a man who had accepted his fate, but with the calculating poise of a man who was already working on his defence. He organised the other prisoners, held court during exercise periods, and attempted to establish a unified front among the defendants, a strategy that, had it succeeded, would have made the prosecution's task considerably more difficult. Some of the other defendants were receptive. Others, particularly those who had already decided to cooperate with the prosecution in hopes of lighter sentences, kept their distance. The dynamics among the prisoners were a miniature version of the power struggles that had characterised the Nazi court: alliances, rivalries, betrayals, and a constant jockeying for position that continued even now, when the only position being jockeyed for was a marginally better chance of avoiding the gallows. The Allies were already planning what would become the most significant legal proceeding of the 20th century. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which would try the major war criminals of the European Axis, was being organised even as the last pockets of German resistance surrendered. Göring was the highest-ranking defendant, the most prominent surviving member of the Nazi leadership, and the man whose trial would set the tone for the entire proceeding. He would face charges of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, charges that, if proven, carried the death penalty. The man who had surrendered with a personal chef and a diamond baton was about to discover that the Americans had not, in fact, been planning to invite him to a strategy conference. They had been planning to put him on trial for his life, and the trial was going to be conducted not with the deference he expected, but with the meticulous, documented, evidence-driven thoroughness that the crimes of the century demanded. The last bluff had been called, and the cards were about to be laid on the table. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was chosen for the trial partly for its symbolism. This was the city where the Nazi Party had held its great rallies, where the racial laws bore its name, where the regime had staged its most spectacular displays of power, and partly for the practical reason that it was one of the few large judicial buildings in Germany that was still standing. The irony of trying the architects of the Third Reich in the city that had served as its ceremonial capital was not lost on anyone involved, though the defendants themselves might have preferred a venue with fewer associations and perhaps better heating. The courtroom, room 600, was a wood-panelled chamber that had been hastily modified to accommodate the unprecedented spectacle of an international war crimes tribunal, a raised dock for the defendants, translation booths for the 4 official languages, a gallery for the press, seating for the judges, and, in a technological innovation that struck many observers as almost futuristic, a system for showing documentary film evidence on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. The stage was set for a legal proceeding unlike anything the world had seen before, and at centre stage, in the front row of the defendant's dock, sat Hermann Göring. The transformed Göring, 30 kilos lighter, drug-free, mentally sharp, had arrived at Nuremberg in September 1945, and he intended to put on one last performance. The International Military Tribunal formally opened on November 20, 1945, with 4 judges representing the 4 prosecuting nations: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The chief prosecutors were Robert H. Jackson for the Americans, Sir Hartley Shawcross for the British, François de Menthon, and later Auguste Champetier de Ribe for the French, and Roman Rudenko for the Soviets. 22 defendants sat in the dock, though one, Martin Bormann, was being tried in absentia, having vanished in the chaos of Berlin's fall and not yet been confirmed dead. Another, Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, had hanged himself in his cell before the trial began, using strips of towel tied to a toilet pipe, which was not the most dignified exit, but at least spared him the proceedings. The remaining 20 defendants represented a cross-section of the Nazi elite: military commanders, government ministers, party ideologues, and administrators whose collective decisions had produced a war that killed approximately 70 million people and a genocide that murdered 6 million Jews along with millions of Roma, disabled persons, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable by the regime. It was, by any measure, the most consequential criminal trial in human history, and Göring, defendant number one, intended to treat it as his personal stage. His strategy was established early and maintained with remarkable consistency throughout the proceedings. Göring would not apologize. He would not express remorse. He would not distance himself from the regime or attempt to minimize his role in it. Instead, he would do what he had always done best. He would perform. He would present himself as a loyal patriot who had served his country, a soldier who had followed orders, a statesman who had pursued German interests in a world that was hostile to German ambitions. He would challenge the legitimacy of the tribunal itself, arguing that the victors had no moral right to judge the vanquished, that the laws under which he was being tried had been created after the fact, and that the Allied nations had committed their own crimes. The bombing of Dresden, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that were no less serious than anything Germany had done. It was a defense strategy designed not to win an acquittal. Göring was realistic enough to know that was impossible, but to control the narrative, to go down fighting, and to establish a version of events that future generations of German nationalists might rally around. The other defendants watched Göring's performance with a mixture of admiration, resentment, and fear. He was, by force of personality, the dominant figure in the dock, and he used this dominance to try to maintain a united front among the defendants, pressuring them during exercise periods and mealtimes to stick to a common line, to avoid blaming each other, and above all to avoid cooperating with the prosecution. Some responded to this pressure. Others, particularly Albert Speer, who had calculated that cooperation and selective contrition offered the best chance of survival, resisted, and the resulting tensions among the defendants added a layer of interpersonal drama to proceedings that were already dramatic enough. Göring was particularly contemptuous of defendants who showed weakness or remorse, viewing any acknowledgement of guilt as a betrayal of the cause and a personal insult to his leadership of the group. He reportedly told one wavering defendant that it was better to hang with honour than to grovel for a few years in prison, a sentiment that was easy to express when you had already decided that grovelling was beneath you regardless of the consequences. The prosecution-'s case against Göring was overwhelming, and the evidence was presented with a methodical thoroughness that left no significant gap for the defence to exploit. The American prosecution team, led by Jackson, had access to an extraordinary archive of captured German documents, millions of pages of official correspondence, memoranda, directives, meeting minutes, and personal papers that the regime had generated with the compulsive bureaucratic productivity that characterized its every activity. The Germans had documented their own crimes with an attention to detail that would have been admirable in any other context, and that was, in this one, devastating. Every major decision, every policy directive, every administrative order had been recorded, filed, and, crucially, preserved, because the regime had not anticipated losing the war, and had therefore seen no reason to destroy the evidence of its actions. The result was a paper trail that connected Göring to virtually every major crime charged in the indictment. The 4 counts against him were comprehensive. Count 1 charged conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, the planning and preparation of aggressive war. Count 2 charged the planning, initiation, and waging of wars of aggression. Count 3 charged war crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war, including the plunder of public and private property, the use of forced labour, and the mistreatment of prisoners of war. Count 4 charged crimes against humanity, persecution, enslavement, and extermination on political, racial, and religious grounds. The evidence supporting each count was voluminous, and the prosecution presented it through a combination of documentary evidence, witness testimony, and, most devastatingly, film. The showing of concentration camp footage in the Nuremberg courtroom remains one of the most dramatic moments in legal history. The films, shot by Allied military cameramen during the liberation of camps including Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and others, showed the world, and the defendants, what the regime had produced. Emaciated survivors barely distinguishable from the dead, mass graves containing thousands of bodies, crematoria with human remains still inside, warehouses filled with the personal effects of the murdered, shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, human hair. The courtroom fell silent during these screenings. Several defendants wept. Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of occupied Poland, reportedly said that 1,000 years would pass and the guilt of Germany would not be erased. Göring did not weep. He watched the footage with an expression that observers described variously as impassive, defiant, or simply blank. The look of a man who had decided that showing emotion would be a concession to the prosecution and who was determined not to give them the satisfaction. Whether this composure reflected genuine indifference, psychological dissociation, or simply an extraordinary capacity for self-control is a question that the psychologists who studied him debated extensively and never fully resolved. The documentary evidence was, if anything, even more damaging than the films, because documents are harder to dismiss than images. Göring's own signature appeared on directives that authorized the creation of the Gestapo, the establishment of concentration camps, the Aryanization of Jewish property, the 4-year plan as exploitation of occupied economies, and, most damningly, the July 1941 memorandum to Heydrich authorizing preparations for the final solution. This last document was the prosecution's single most powerful piece of evidence against Göring personally, because it connected him directly, in his own handwriting and over his own signature, to the initiation of the bureaucratic process that led to the systematic murder of 6 million people. Göring's defense, that the document was merely an administrative authorization, that he had not known the full implications of what he was signing, that the actual decisions were made by others, was technically accurate in its narrowest interpretation and morally bankrupt in every other respect. He had signed the order had led to Auschwitz. No amount of legal passing could change that chain of causation. Göring's cross-examination by Jackson was the dramatic centerpiece of the trial, and it did not go entirely as the prosecution had hoped. Jackson, a Supreme Court justice who was a brilliant legal mind but not a natural courtroom cross-examiner, attempted to pin Göring down on specific facts and specific documents, expecting the defendant to crumble under the weight of the evidence. Instead, Göring treated the cross-examination as a debating exercise, using every question as an opportunity to deliver speeches, redirect the conversation, and challenge the prosecution's framing. He was evasive, verbose, and tactically aggressive, answering questions he wanted to answer at great length, and deflecting questions he did not want to answer, with a combination of semantic quibbling, historical digressions, and outright filibustering. Jackson, visibly frustrated, struggled to control the exchange, and there were moments when observers felt that Göring was winning the battle for the courtroom's attention, if not its sympathy. The British cross-examiner, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, was considerably more effective. His questioning was tighter, more focused, and less susceptible to Göring's rhetorical diversions, and it was during Maxwell Fyfe's cross-examination that some of the most damaging admissions were extracted. The trial lasted 10 months, from November 1945 to October 1946, and over the course of those months, the prosecution presented evidence that filled volumes and consumed hundreds of hours of courtroom time. Witnesses testified to the horrors of the camps, the brutality of the occupation, the systematic looting of entire nations, and the calculated machinery of extermination that the regime had constructed. Göring sat through all of it, maintaining his composure, occasionally smirking, sometimes passing notes to his defense counsel, and never, not once, displaying the kind of genuine remorse that might have suggested he understood the magnitude of what had been done. The psychological dimension of the trial was almost as fascinating as the legal one, and it produced some of the most remarkable character studies in the history of forensic psychology. The defendants were examined by 2 mental health professionals, the American psychiatrist Douglas Kelly and the psychologist Gustave Gilbert, who conducted extensive interviews, administered EQ tests, and gave each defendant the Rorschach ink blot test in what became one of the most analysed psychological datasets of the 20th century. Göring's results were predictably complicated. His IQ score of 138 placed him at the top of the defendants, above Speer, Donitz, and even Schacht. His Rorschach responses revealed a personality that combined high intelligence with emotional shallowness, narcissistic grandiosity, and an almost complete absence of genuine empathy. He could understand other people's emotions intellectually but did not appear to experience them as real. Kelly later wrote that Göring was an amiable psychopath, a term that captures both his surface charm and the void beneath it rather precisely. Gilbert's interactions with Göring were particularly revealing. The psychologist visited the defendants in their cells regularly, recording their conversations in notes that were later published, and that provide an extraordinary window into the minds of men on trial for their lives. Göring used these sessions the way he used every social interaction, as an opportunity to perform, to charm, to dominate. He treated Gilbert as an audience rather than an examiner, offering expansive monologues about history, strategy, and his own importance that were clearly designed to impress rather than to reveal. When Gilbert confronted him with specific evidence of atrocities, showing him photographs, reading him testimony, describing the reality of what had been done in his name, Göring would retreat into deflection. He would blame Himmler for the camps, blame Goebbels for the propaganda, blame subordinates for exceeding their instructions, blame the war itself for creating conditions in which terrible things happened. What he would never do, what he was constitutionally incapable of doing, was accept that he bore personal moral responsibility for the suffering of millions of human beings. The psychological armour that had been forged in the nursery of Burg Weldenstein, reinforced in the cockpit over the Western Front and polished in the salons of Weimar Germany, was even now impenetrable. The daily routine of the prison was designed to prevent exactly the kind of psychological dominance that Göring was attempting to establish. Defendants were held in individual cells, approximately 13 feet by 6, furnished with a cot, a small table, a chair, and a toilet. They were observed through a peephole at irregular intervals, a measure intended to prevent suicide attempts, and a light was kept on in each cell at all times, which made sleeping difficult and which several defendants complained about with considerable bitterness, though their complaints were received with approximately the same sympathy as a restaurant review from a man who had burned down the restaurant. Exercise was permitted in a small courtyard, and it was during these exercise periods that Göring held court among his fellow defendants, discussing the day's proceedings, coordinating defense strategies, and dispensing encouragement and intimidation in roughly equal measure. Meals were adequate but institutional, a far cry from the elaborate menus of Karen Hall, and the absence of alcohol, drugs, and luxury seemed to sharpen rather than diminish Göring's faculties, as though the creature comforts that had surrounded him for years had been dulling rather than sustaining the mind beneath. One of Gilbert S.'s most frequently cited observations was a remark Göring made during a conversation about how leaders persuade ordinary people to follow them into war. Göring, speaking with the casual authority of a man who had done exactly this for 2 decades, explained that it was straightforward. You tell the people they are being attacked, you denounce anyone who advocates peace as unpatriotic, and you repeat both messages until the population is sufficiently frightened and angry to do whatever you ask. The statement was chilling not because it was original, the technique is as old as politics itself, but because of the matter-of-fact tone in which it was delivered. Göring was not boasting, he was not confessing. He was simply describing a mechanism he had observed and participated in, with the detached precision of an engineer explaining how a machine works. The absence of moral awareness in the explanation was, in its own way, the most damning testimony of the entire trial, more revealing than any document or any photograph, because it showed not what Göring had done but how he thought about what he had done, which was, as a technical problem, solved successfully, with no ethical dimension worth considering. His defence, when it came, was a virtuoso performance of deflection. He accepted responsibility in the broadest, vaguest terms. Yes, he had been a leader of the regime. Yes, decisions had been made. Yes, things had happened that were regrettable, while simultaneously denying specific knowledge of specific atrocities and insisting that he had been motivated throughout by patriotism rather than criminality. It was, in essence, the final version of the act he had been performing his entire political career, the civilized face of an uncivilized movement, the reasonable man in an unreasonable system, and he delivered it with the skill of a man who had been practicing for 25 years. The tribunal deliberated for approximately a month before delivering its verdicts on October 1, 1946. The judgments were read individually, each defendant standing alone to hear the Court-S determination of his fate. Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts. Guilty of conspiracy, guilty of waging aggressive war, guilty of war crimes, guilty of crimes against humanity. The verdict was not a surprise. The evidence had been overwhelming, and no reasonable tribunal could have reached a different conclusion. But the sentence that followed was, Göring had expected death, and death was what he received. The tribunal sentenced him to execution by hanging. But Göring had one final request. He asked to be shot, executed by firing squad, as befitting a soldier and a military commander, rather than hanged like a common criminal. The request was denied. The tribunal ruled that death by hanging was the appropriate method for crimes of this magnitude, and that the defendants' military rank did not entitle them to a more dignified form of execution. Göring received the news with visible anger. The distinction between hanging and shooting mattered enormously to him, because it was the difference between dying as a soldier and dying as a criminal, and his entire defence had been built around the proposition that he was the former rather than the latter. The tribunal's refusal to grant even this small concession meant that the narrative he'd been constructing would end not with a military salute, but with a noose. The execution was scheduled for October 15, 1946. In the days between the sentence and the scheduled hanging, Göring was placed under intensified security. Guards were stationed outside his cell around the clock, checks were conducted at regular intervals, and his personal effects were searched repeatedly for contraband. The security measures reflected a genuine concern that the highest-profile defendant might attempt to take his own life before the sentence could be carried out, and the concern was entirely justified, because that was exactly what Göring was planning to do. On the night of October 15th, approximately 2 hours before he was scheduled to be escorted to the execution chamber, Göring bit down on a small glass capsule containing potassium cyanide. The poison acted within minutes. By the time the guards discovered what had happened, he was dead. His body was found on his cot, his face still bearing traces of the expression he had worn in his final moments, which, depending on which account you read, was either a grimace of pain or something closer to a smile. The man who had spent his life evading consequences had evaded the final one, dying on his own terms rather than the tribunal-s, and the manner of his death immediately raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The mystery of the cyanide capsule is one of the enduring puzzles of the Nuremberg trial. How did Göring obtain the poison? How did he conceal it through months of imprisonment, multiple searches, and continuous surveillance? The prison authorities launched an immediate investigation, and several theories were advanced. One possibility was that Göring had hidden the capsule among his personal effects from the beginning, concealed in a container of pomade, or inside a piece of luggage, or in some other item that had survived the initial searches. Another theory suggested that the capsule had been smuggled to him by a sympathizer, a guard, a visitor, or a member of the prison staff who had been bribed, coerced, or ideologically motivated to assist. A third possibility was that Göring had possessed the capsule throughout his imprisonment and had simply been extraordinarily careful in concealing it, moving it from hiding place to hiding place as the security regime tightened. An American guard named Herbert Lee Stivers confessed decades later, in 2005, that he had unwittingly passed the capsule to Göring, hidden inside a pen that a German woman, who had befriended Stivers and given him a story about delivering medicine, had asked him to deliver. Whether this account is fully accurate remains debated, but it offered the first plausible explanation for a mystery that had persisted for nearly 60 years. The reaction to Göring's suicide was immediate and intense. The Allied authorities were furious. The death was a security failure that embarrassed the prison command and robbed the tribunal of the symbolic act of executing its most prominent defendant. Colonel Andrus, the prison commandant who had staked his professional reputation on maintaining security, was reportedly devastated. Göring's final letter to him, informing him that the capsule had been in his possession all along, was a parting humiliation that Andrus carried for the rest of his career. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive at the time, producing more theories than answers and leaving the Allied authorities in the uncomfortable position of having to explain how the most closely watched prisoner in the world had managed to kill himself under their noses. The other defendants received varying fates that reflected the tribunal's attempt to calibrate punishment to individual responsibility. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging: Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Rosenberg, Frick, Streicher, Seyss-Inquart, Zorkel, Frank, Kaltenbrunner, Bormann in absentia, and Göring. 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment: Hess, Funk, and Raeder. 4 received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years: Donitz, Speer, von Neurath, and von Schirach. 3 were acquitted: Schacht, von Papen, and Fritzsche. Verdicts that provoked controversy and outrage from those who felt that the men's roles in the regime warranted conviction, regardless of whether specific crimes could be legally proven against them. The acquittals demonstrated that the tribunal was, at least in some respects, functioning as a genuine court, rather than a rubber stamp for predetermined outcomes, a distinction that mattered enormously for the legitimacy of the proceedings, even if it was deeply unsatisfying to those who had lost family members to the regime's policies. The 10 condemned men who had not managed to obtain cyanide capsules were hanged in the early hours of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison, which had been converted into an execution chamber with 3 gallows erected side by side. The hangings were carried out by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, an American military executioner whose competence has been questioned by historians. Several of the condemned men reportedly did not die instantly from broken necks, as intended, but instead strangled slowly, a process that took up to 25 minutes in some cases. Whether this was due to miscalculated rope lengths, improper knot placement, or deliberate negligence remains debated. Ribbentrop was the first to hang, and Seyss-Inquart the last. Their bodies, along with Göring-S, were loaded onto trucks, driven to a crematorium in Munich, incinerated, and the ashes scattered in the Isar River to prevent the creation of any memorial or shrine. The disposal was deliberately anonymous. No markers, no graves, no plaques. Nothing that could serve as a rallying point for future admirers. The men who had built monuments to themselves across Europe would have no monument of their own. Even in death they would be denied the thing they had craved most: permanence. Göring's final letters, written in his cell in the hours before his death, were addressed to his wife Emmy, to the prison commandant Colonel Burton Andrus, and to the Allied Control Council. To Emmy he wrote with affection and a kind of self-justifying tenderness, presenting himself as a man who had done his best in impossible circumstances and who was choosing to die rather than submit to what he considered a dishonouring form of execution. To Andrus he wrote with barely concealed contempt, informing the commandant that he had possessed the cyanide capsule throughout his imprisonment and that the security measures had been less effective than Andrus believed. The letter to the Allied Control Council was longer and more political, a final statement in which Göring defended his actions, rejected the tribunal's jurisdiction, and insisted that he had acted throughout as a patriotic German whose only crime was loyalty to his country. It was in essence the closing argument he had not been permitted to deliver in court, the last version of the narrative he had been constructing since the dock, polished and perfected in his final hours and addressed to an audience that extended beyond the courtroom to posterity itself. The question of what Göring's story ultimately means, what lessons it holds, what warnings it offers, what it tells us about the capacity of human beings to do terrible things while maintaining a belief in their own decency, is not one that can be answered in a single paragraph or even a single book. He was not a monster in the cinematic sense, not a figure of pure evil operating from motives that are incomprehensible to ordinary people. He was something more disturbing than that. He was a recognizable human being, vain, insecure, ambitious, charming, greedy, talented in some respects and catastrophically flawed in others, who made a series of choices, each one leading logically to the next, that carried him from a childhood of privilege and humiliation to the innermost circle of the worst regime in modern history. He chose to join the Nazi movement. He chose to build its instruments of terror. He chose to profit from its crimes. He chose to sign the document that set the machinery of genocide in motion. And he chose, at the end, to die on his own terms rather than face the full weight of accountability for those choices. Each of these was a choice. None of them was inevitable. And the fact that a man of intelligence, education, and social advantage could make every one of them, and sleep soundly afterward, is perhaps the most unsettling thing about Hermann Göring's story. The Nuremberg trial established principles of international law that continue to shape the world we live in. The principle that aggressive war is a crime, that crimes against humanity can be prosecuted regardless of national sovereignty, that following orders is not a defence, and that individuals bear personal responsibility for the actions of the states they serve. These principles were imperfect in their application. The Soviet Union's presence on the prosecution bench, given its own record of aggression and atrocity, was an irony that the defence exploited at every opportunity, but they established a legal framework that has been invoked in every subsequent international tribunal, from The Hague to Rwanda to Cambodia. Göring's trial was the foundation stone of that framework, and his conviction remains one of the most important legal precedents in the history of human rights law. The man who spent his life evading accountability helped create, through the very act of being held accountable, a system designed to ensure that future leaders could not evade it so easily. His legacy is written not in monuments, but in absences. The paintings that still hang in uncertain provenance on gallery walls around the world, the families whose lineage was severed by the policies he sanctioned, the cities whose skylines were shaped by the bombs his air force dropped, and the bombs that were dropped in return. The boy from Berg Weldenstein who grew up in someone else's castle, who found glory in the sky, and then spent the rest of his life trying to recapture it through politics, plunder, and self-aggrandizement, ended his story on a cot in a Nuremberg cell with a glass capsule between his teeth. He had cheated the hangman, he had not cheated history. And on that note, thank you for sticking with me through this one. It was a long ride, and not always a comfortable one, but I think stories like this matter, not because the people in them deserve our attention, but because understanding how they got where they got helps us recognize the warning signs when we see them again. If you made it this far, you are genuinely dedicated, and I appreciate that more than you know. Drop a like if this was worth your time, subscribe if you want more deep dives like this, and leave a comment telling me what historical figure you think we should tackle next. Now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is on your clock, good night, sweet dreams, and sleep well. I will see you in the next one.